Chapter 951, Stubborn Tamers. Selphira turned her head and looked at him. Only one moment before focusing in the front again. Your father sacrificed himself because it was the only option available, and because he was the only person who could do it. She glanced back at the shield. Your situation is neither of those. But the outcome would still be better than the alternatives. We need you that can still use beasts and skills more. Outcome isn't the only thing that matters in a decision, Victor. If it were, I'd have been taking shortcuts for 300 years that I have never taken after the last one. Another centimeter? 24.98 meters left. And I have no intention of carrying you home as a statue. You wouldn't have to spend so much mana. If you use me here, I can do what? Watch you slowly expire in my arms. Something that in another person's voice would have been a scold came out of hers as something drier, a short exhale that acknowledged the absurdity without committing to finding it as an option. Don't be ridiculous. I'm not being ridiculous. I'm being realistic. At your age, you don't know the difference yet. Victor opened his mouth. Closed it. Selphira used the silence. She checked him sideways, careful enough that he wouldn't notice. The crystallization had moved past the shoulder and edged slightly toward his neck. It hadn't progressed in the last hour, not since the initial exposure, which was, within the narrow range of available good news, the best she had. The rest of him looked better than it had any right to, all things considered. But under no circumstances should he tank it anymore. She turned her attention back to herself. 3 small crystal formations had appeared on her left forearm in the last 20 minutes. None of them had been there before. Small enough that they didn't restrict movement yet. But they were growing despite the shield. That was the part worth noting. Despite the shield she'd been reinforcing and maintaining and feeding mana into without pause. The shield that was supposed to be protecting her. Selphira filed it away, adjusted her grip, and kept pushing. The crystallization didn't hurt. That was almost beside the point. What mattered was what it meant. Orion's beam was bleeding through the shield with a consistency she didn't want to dwell on. She could feel each new formation on her forearm the way you feel a splinter you can't reach. She had less mana than she needed. Not dramatically less, but just enough less to matter. We're going to make it to the top, she told Victor, and her voice carried no cracks, no hesitation, nothing he could use to build a counter-argument. Victor didn't respond immediately. When he did, his tone had the measured quality of someone deciding whether a fight was worth starting. You're sure? I'm sure. She shifted the shield's concentration toward the right edge, where the spiral was biting hardest. The adjustment bought her roughly 2 seconds of easier pressure. Stop asking me questions and save what you have left for when we reach the entrance. You're going to need it for running. Victor obeyed. That, more than anything, told her everything she needed to know about his condition. When Victor obeyed without pushing back, without one more angle, without at least a pointed look to register his disagreement, things were genuinely bad. He'd pushed them 30 meters with a fully crystallized arm, 30 meters that would have cost her twice the mana to cover at the same pace without him. That was more than anyone should have managed in his state, more than she would have expected. But that contribution was done. If she forced more out of him now, she wouldn't be carrying Victor out of here, but a big useless souvenir. So she let him push from behind and took the beam alone. 10 more meters gone. She'd covered them, but not the way she would have liked. The ice shield trembled with an irregularity she'd been working to mask for several minutes now, the kind of subtle wobble that an untrained eye might miss but that Selphira felt in her palms. The shield was arguing with her. The fusion she'd kept in reserve as a last measure had started costing more energy just to maintain than it should have, the upkeep bleeding into the same reserves she needed for the push itself. 15 meters left. I knew it. Victor's voice came from just behind her. Let me go to the front. You look too tired. He had waited, with precise and irritating accuracy, for the exact moment when the shield was most compromised to say it. No, said Selphira. I can take more impact than you right now and... I said no, Victor. My arm doesn't feel anything, I swear to you it's not. Exactly. She didn't raise her voice. She never raised her voice when she was right, because being right didn't require volume to prove. If you put that side forward, the one that's already stopped feeling, you won't notice when it's too late. And your stubborn skull will become crystal before you realize you've crossed the line. A sigh. Although I suppose that might be an improvement. Victor opened his mouth, then he stopped moving it. Then he moved it again with that particular expression he made when he knew he'd lost the argument but wasn't ready to finish losing it. What about you, then? Selphira considered how long to take answering that. She used the time to reposition the shield half an inch higher. What about me? What? You have crystals on your face. Selphira didn't blink. It was true. The first formations had appeared on her forearm some time ago, but somewhere in the last few minutes, while she was redistributing what remained of her mana as efficiently as the situation allowed, compressing her technique down to its smallest workable shape, new ones had appeared. 2 on her left cheekbone, catching the chaotic lights on the stairwell. 1 at the side of her neck, small but positioned poorly, stiffening the rotation when she turned her head. She felt them. They didn't hurt. But they were there the way unwelcome things are always there. They don't bother me, she said. That's exactly what I just told you about mine. Chapter 952, Stubborn Tamers, 2. Selphira smiled. Victor. The same tone she used with students who kept making the same technical mistake 3 weeks after she'd corrected it. We are not the same. A pause. Besides, they suit me. Which was also true, in a way she hadn't expected. The crystals caught on her cheekbone in a way that happened to cover the lines age had carved into that part of her face, a small and absurd side effect that she filed away without comment. Silence. Then, from behind her, where Victor was pushing against her back to help with the weight of the climb, came a sound she needed a moment to place. A laugh. Not bitter or polite. A real laugh, surprised out of him, the kind that happens when something strikes a person as genuinely absurd at the worst possible moment to find anything absurd. You're completely insane, said Victor, and there was something in his voice that hadn't been there before. Something with less weight to it. Yes. Selphira drove the shield 2 more centimeters upward. 14.98 meters. But I'm not so insane that I'm going to let you sacrifice yourself after all I invested here. Victor was quiet for a moment. If we don't make it? He started. We're going to make it. I'm only saying, if. Victor. Fine. Do whatever you want, you crazy old woman. A beat. If we die down here, at least I'm better off listening to your nonsense than suffering alone down there. Selphira considered that. It wasn't an elegantly constructed compliment. Victor had many qualities, but eloquence had never been the most prominent. He was too direct to be eloquent, too honest to polish things before saying them. What came out was what he actually meant, every time, with no decoration. It was, in that way, more reliable than anything more carefully worded would have been. It was exactly the sort of thing he would say. Shut your mouth and don't call me a crazy old woman ever again, she said, or I will actually let you crystallize and use you as part of my shield when you're a statue. A crystallized idiot weighs less on my nerves than one who talks. Victor laughed again. Shorter this time, but just as real. Is that an insult or a tactical proposal? You never learn. The beam pressed. She felt it in the shield's weight, in the way the ice cracked with a sound she didn't like, in the fraction of a second where the backward force outpaced the upward one and she had to compensate without warning, redistributing her footing and the angle in one motion that cost her more than it should have. Victor perceived it too. She knew without looking. You're completely focused, she said. I am completely focused. Which is what you should also be, instead of cataloguing my face. Victor said nothing to that. The problem with honesty was that it normally arrived at the worst moments. Selphira had spent decades being honest with herself in situations where most people would have chosen the comfort of refusing to look. It was a habit she'd built over a very long time, and one that was nearly impossible to suspend, even in circumstances where the comfort would have been considerably easier to carry than the truth. So when the calculation resolved itself with uncomfortable clarity, she accepted it without argument. They couldn't make it to the top. Not as things stood. She had mana for perhaps 5 more meters, 6 if she compressed every usage to its theoretical minimum and made no mistakes. But Orion's beam was not the only problem waiting at the top of those 14 meters. If she reached the threshold by some big miracle, he could reactivate the barrier in seconds. The same barrier that had eaten her best techniques on the way in would seal the entrance before she crossed it. She knew what a lost battle looked like. She also knew that recognizing a lost battle and stopping were 2 entirely different decisions. Victor had said something earlier about Dragarian. About honoring a family tradition, if becoming a statue was what the moment called for. He'd said it with the calm he put on when he wanted to appear indifferent to something he actually cared about very much, and Selphira had registered every word without acknowledging them at the time. She thought about Dragarian now. The way he looked on the day he gave up everything, forward-facing, not one step back, his posture saying something clear about who he had decided to be at the end. She had known him long enough to be able to copy the exact same bearing. Selphira was not Dragarian. She was shorter, she had 200 more years of lines beneath the crystals on her cheekbone, and her beasts were not the stuff of legend the way his had been. She had different advantages, different history, a different way of arriving at the same decisions. But the posture, at least, could be the same. So she kept pushing. Upstairs, Orion had been ignoring the ringing in his ears for the better part of the last hour. It wasn't sharp. It was the low, dull kind that settled in after maintaining a technique past the point the body naturally recommended, when concentration began drawing on reserves he hadn't asked permission to use. The sound of sustained effort catching up to him, not dangerous, not yet, but present enough that pretending otherwise required a small continuous effort of its own. Chapter 953, Stubborn Tamer Rulers. Orion was very tired. He had been pretending otherwise. The honest reason was that acknowledging it meant acknowledging that the old woman was costing him more than he had planned for. Which was not, strictly speaking, his fault. The plan had accounted for Victor as a hostage and nothing more. A tamer with a half-crystallized arm and days of captivity behind him had no business functioning as a meaningful shield. By any reasonable calculation, he shouldn't have any fight left in him or strength enough to matter. But Victor's partially crystallized body had turned out to be denser than Orion's estimate accounted for. It had absorbed impacts for far longer than it had any right to before Selphira finally pulled him back. That miscalculation had cost him. Not critically, but he could feel the expense in the ringing, in the slight delay between decision and response that hadn't been there at the start. He could have switched to the barrier and let himself recharge. That option had always been available. But he'd set it aside because giving Selphira even a brief respite meant giving her the choice to fully beat his soldiers and move deeper into the ruins, and hunting her down afterward would have opened a window for other problems he preferred to keep closed. He didn't have days to spend on one old woman. So he held the beam here. And if she could keep pushing, he'd have to endure it with his ears ringing, more easily. The distance between them had dropped to nearly 10 meters. Clearly, the old woman was incredibly stubborn, more than was reasonable. But there was a limit, and she was obviously approaching it. Every meter she gained now was costing her more than the one before, and at a certain point she would simply run out regardless of what she was willing to accept. They couldn't be far from done now. Orion added another rotation to the spiral and held his concentration steady. 9 meters. Selphira's skill started failing, and Victor recognized it before she said anything. Because there was nothing to say. He knew that kind of failure from the inside. It was the same silent unraveling he'd experienced the first time Orion's beam had pressed him alone, the body still trying to channel mana that couldn't move freely through the crystal blockages anymore, still sending the signal, still insisting, and what came out the other side was a fraction of what it should have been. Irregular and unreliable. He had taken his potion back then, had fought with everything he had and still hadn't made it out. Selphira had no potion now either. Victor looked at the crystals that now covered areas on almost her entire body. He knew exactly what it felt like when the body started to lock, to stiffen. He'd been living that knowledge in his own body for hours. He knew they weren't going to reach the exit. But Selphira kept pushing. Not with the strength she'd had at the start, and not even with what she'd had 5 minutes ago. With what remained, which was considerably less than enough, yet she was spending it anyway. No complaints. Not one word asking him to take her place, not one moment where she turned to him and acknowledged that her math had stopped working. She just kept the broken shield up and kept moving, meter by meter, as though the numbers were a problem she'd deal with once she was done or dead. Victor had spent most of his life testing the edges of her patience. She had spent just as many years of her life refusing to let him give up on things that still had breath in them, even when he couldn't see it himself. He understood, watching her now, that he was never going to convince her to let him sacrifice himself, neither in life nor in death. She wasn't going to step aside and let him absorb the beam. She wasn't going to let him be the one to stay behind. Maybe they were more alike than he'd been willing to admit. At least on the subject of stubbornness. He put his good hand on what remained of her shield, beside hers. "I understand," he said, low enough since it didn't need to carry far. Not surrender. Something closer to recognition, of the kind that only comes when a person finally stops arguing with a truth they've been circling for a while. Selphira didn't respond, she just kept pushing. Victor silently pushed with her. Upstairs, Orion's ears were still ringing. It had crossed the threshold from temporary discomfort into the kind of thing that settles underneath everything else, layering a dull fatigue over thought and movement that he refused to name correctly. The body's way of presenting a bill he hadn't agreed to sign. He noted it and set it aside, because acknowledging it meant acknowledging what had caused it, and what had caused it was a woman in her final reserves who still hadn't stopped. But it was almost over. He could see that now. The last shield had fractured in a way that told him everything he needed to know. There was a specific quality to the resistance when a tamer was running on will instead of mana, a rigidity that came not from the skill but from the person holding it, a stubbornness that had its own texture and that could not, in the end, substitute for what it was trying to replace. He'd seen that quality in her shield for the last minutes. The ice wasn't responding the way it should. It was responding the way it could. Not much longer. Orion held his concentration with the inflexibility of a man who has decided he is not going to release first no matter what. Watching the distance close. Almost there. The energy burst hit his senses from behind with almost no warning at all. A whistle, and the sharp, flying feathers pierced him. Chapter 954, Stubborn Tamer Rulers, 2. Orion had spent enough years practicing his agility and sensitivity in combat, preparing for this day when he would take down the opposing leaders, for his body to react before his mind had even finished understanding what was happening. He had spent years drilling the instincts for exactly this kind of moment. Not for this specific situation, but for the general shape of it, the possibility that any engagement might open a second front in a direction he wasn't watching. His body half transformed into his black tiger and moved before his mind had finished processing what was happening, throwing him sideways on pure reflex. Several of the feathers passed through the space where his back had been a half-second earlier. They weren't decorative. They were the size of long daggers, each one edged with a density of concentrated mana that drove them into the stone floor up to their shafts when they missed their mark. But several didn't miss entirely. He felt impacts across his back and upper legs, sharp and immediate, the kind of pain that registers as fear of death before it registers as pain, and that told him the damage was serious before he'd even hit the ground. He activated the barrier from the floor before he even finished falling. He had made that decision instinctively too, before thinking of standing up, because standing first would have cost him a moment he didn't have. The barrier expanded outward around him and caught the second wave of feathers that followed almost immediately after the first. When he finally got himself upright and oriented, he realized two things first in rapid succession. Not that he was obviously under attack, but the beam he had been directing into the tunnel no longer existed. And the entrance was open. He moved almost instantly after touching the ground to reposition the barrier over the tunnel mouth. One fast scramble pushing his body with his tiger claws to close the angle, to block what he already knew had to be happening below. He didn't make it. Selphira had been ready thanks to her sheer stubbornness. That was the only reason. She also hadn't waited for the situation to explain itself to her. She'd felt the pressure disappear and move before the reason had time to matter. She had survived for too many years and knew not to wait for explanations when riding the moment. She came out of the tunnel at top speed, dragging Victor with her, burning what remained of her fusion into pure velocity because velocity was the only currency that meant anything in those specific seconds. Orion turned to take in what was behind him. The wide chamber where he had left the smaller, elite portion of his forces managing the perimeter was no longer the contained situation he'd set up before going underground. The geometry of it had changed entirely. The people and their positions were wrong in ways that took him a moment to fully map, because the wrongness was spread across too many points at once. Arturo was at the center of it. The middle brother, who had never had Victor's natural authority or Julius's ease with people, who had always been the one who compensated for those absences by calculating carefully and refusing to stop working. And he had brought people with him who had no business being here. Zhao came down fast, adjusting his angle mid-descent with the direct, economical movement of someone who had no time to be elegant about it. He caught Selphira and Victor cleanly and pulled into a sharp turn in the air that carried all three of them away from the tunnel mouth's vicinity and into the coordinated retreat the rest of the group was already forming. Full retreat! His voice carried the right amount of mana behind it, not a shout, but something with enough structure to reach everyone who needed to hear it through the noise. We have who we came for. Although she would have liked to give Orion a few good blows. Selphira did not protest. She just cancelled her fusion. Zhao and Victor both registered that in the same moment, and neither of them said anything about it, because there was nothing useful to say. The fact that she let it go without argument communicated her state more precisely than any description of it would have. Orion launched black beams from the barrier he'd anchored at the ruin's entrance, but the target positions were already abandoned by the time the first ones landed. The group's shields also came up in layers as they pulled back. It wasn't a perfect retreat, far from it, but Orion's group wasn't that large and Ren's elite with the ability to use fusions balanced the battlefield quite well, especially since they didn't need to win and their ground control, thanks to the large number of members of Julius's special unit, was so high. The unit Julius had built for exactly this kind of job, underground movement, terrain management, the particular skill set that made retreating look like a good decision rather than a failure, was doing what it had been built to do. They were giving ground deliberately, at their own pace, toward tunnels they had already used. Slowly, the reinforced stone between them and Orion's remaining forces grew. Pulling those feathers out was the kind of pain that demanded full attention and didn't accept negotiations about timing. He dealt with it. He had spent a long time training himself not to let physical pain restructure his priorities, and he applied that training now with the same systematic approach he applied to everything else. The healer he'd kept assigned to himself worked quickly, and within a few minutes the damage had moved from urgent to manageable. Removing those enormous knives from his body hurt, but being left without his hostages hurt even more. He could have used those two to eliminate Arturo, but it was too late now. Orion left the underground and stepped out through the castle. The air outside had the particular weight of a battlefield that had been running for hours. Heavy with dust and residual energy, the distinct quality of large amounts of mana burned in a compressed space over a short time. He took it in without commenting on it, because it was a detail and not the detail that mattered. His army had changed shape since he'd gone underground. Chapter 955, Stubborn Tamer's Crisis. Orion's army. The more the Reliables half had entrenched itself close to the castle using the reinforced stone wall formations, they had losses that Orion had already estimated from what he could observe and that fell within the margins he'd calculated for this phase. Acceptable numbers, given what they'd accomplished. The other half. The portion that had chosen the least convenient possible moment to develop independent opinions, had broken formation and was now fighting alongside an army that should not have arrived yet. Their techniques were directed against a section of the flow of mutants that was moving with more autonomy than Orion had been actively directing. He noticed that last part just now. He pulled his attention to the crystals that were currently serving as the anchors for his barrier and checked the control of the corrupted beasts out of habit. The flow was present. The connection was there, responsive, functioning. He made a small adjustment to the mutants' direction, a slight correction to test the response. They moved accordingly. No problem. He held the observation for a moment, then settled it. He'd been underground managing the tunnel for a sustained period, occupied with a level of technical focus that didn't leave room for active management of the flow, just the previous ordered direction. But they had changed the target direction slightly not long ago. The mutants had continued attacking on their own momentum, which was what they did when no active direction was applied. That was their nature, not a malfunction. The connection had been intact the whole time. He told himself this with the certainty of a man who has reached a conclusion and sees no reason to revisit it. He redirected the flow in full. The mutants that the new defender group and the defectors had been contending with shifted direction, pressing with their full numbers toward the new army and the traitors alike, pushing them back from the castle's perimeter, away from the ground Orion still controlled. It wasn't an optimal outcome. The pressure on the city castle and the academy would ease with the mutants partially reoriented, and that respite was a cost he'd have preferred not to pay. But it recovered the territorial position the remaining half of his army could regroup well first and breathe. He considered the full accounting of what today had produced. Selphira and Victor had made it out. That was the entry on the balance sheet that carried the most weight, and he wasn't going to pretend otherwise or dress it up as something more favorable than it was. They had escaped. That was the fact. But Selphira had come out of the tunnel as a woman who had burned through everything she had, her body compromised from crystals as Victor had been first, something she had no way to recover from. Victor wasn't in any fighting condition either. Whatever threat either of them represented in their current state was negligible compared to what they would have been at full capacity. They were no longer useful as fighters. They were no longer a factor he needed to plan around. They were just hostages. The second step of the plan had never depended on them to begin with. It depended on joining the groups waiting on the other side of the city, the ones who had stayed out of today's engagement by deliberate order, the ones who had watched from a distance while the first moves were made, the ones who would now march alongside what remained of his army with the weight of the crystals behind them. It depended on clearly making the situation obvious for the people and demanding what's theirs. With that force and with the mutants under control, the castle would have no workable choice but to yield the remaining ruins and the access they represented to start his full connection with the crystals. And then the final step. But he knew there was a small extra problem he had to address fast first. Orion thought briefly about the strange boy and allowed himself to feel something that wasn't quite satisfactory. With time the kid could find a way to reverse crystallization. So he needed to finish him now. There would be no time to find a cure. No time to recover what had already been neutralized, nor time or room to grow into something capable of closing the distance between them with some magical training arc. It was now or never. For both of them. Earth was the most boring element to explain and the hardest to stop. Julius had known that since he was old enough to argue about elements with anyone willing to listen, and he had confirmed it enough times in actual combat that the theory no longer needed demonstration. Fire was spectacular and powerful. Wood was impressive, its growth input arriving almost instantly when you needed it. Wind was silent and sharp. Water was versatile, beloved for how it healed. Each of them had a moment, a peak, a reason people talked about them. And Earth was the one less talked but still pushing when everyone else had finished doing impressive things. The twins had understood that too late. Orion had tested their capability beforehand, trusted them with the mutant flow, but his brothers hadn't inherited his obsession, his strong will or his patience. They had many mistakes after a while. When Julius's group found the seam in their control and pushed toward it, the twins lost the thread. The mutants drifted. Not for long, just long enough, but Julius had spent his entire career building a life on those kinds of moments and he wasn't going to waste this one. His group moved hard toward the exit while the twins scrambled to re-establish the flow and blame each other for losing it. By the time they coordinated again, it was too late to stop the retreat entirely by only redirecting mutants. So they had done what panicked people with firepower tend to do, they escalated. The combined beam arrived to cut off Julius's group. Fire and water twisted together in a combination that was technically chaotic but technically coherent, the kind of technique that took real cooperation to produce and real discipline to maintain under pressure. Julius absorbed the first impact with a reinforced mineral shield and noticed something the twins probably didn't know he would notice. The beam fluctuated. It was a genuine achievement, synchronizing two separate tamers well enough to make a technique that heavy and complex viable at all. One person would have struggled to execute it at all. Two people executing it together were capable of something neither could produce alone. But two people controlling a single technique always had that problem. That millisecond of difference between one person's impulse and the other's, invisible under normal conditions, indistinguishable from noise unless you were looking for it specifically. In most fights it didn't matter. Against most opponents it would never surface. But Julius was the kind of person who looked for the crack in people. He had been doing it since long before he had any business doing it, and he was very good at it. His group also had an advantage the twins hadn't fully accounted for. Earth was the element with the best internal synergy of all of them. His tamer's mana was compatible not just with his own but with each other's, the flow passing between them and returning reinforced in a way that resembled a battery that recharged itself from the effort of being used. Not infinite efficiency. Just extended efficiency, which in a long fight was exactly the same thing as the only efficiency that mattered. They formed the feedback pattern Julius had been preparing since he first identified the fluctuation. The mineral shield reshaped itself into something narrower and more reactive to the spin, a drill that matched the spiral's own rotation and drove against it along the axis of least resistance. It was patient work. It required everyone to trust the pattern and not flinch from the pressure, and his tamers trusted it because they'd seen it work before and because Julius had a way of communicating absolute confidence in a plan without saying anything about it directly. The twins had no sophistication available to them at that point. They had panic, and they had supposedly unmatched firepower, so when they saw Julius advancing anyway they had more panic. By the time a few meters separated Julius from the exit, the twins had already switched to their barrier and ran. Which was, if Julius was being honest with himself, a relief. Maintaining the fusion much longer would have started costing him in ways he would have felt later, and not having to fight through a last desperate push let him conserve the reserves he'd need above ground. They came out with more left in them than he'd expected to have. In summary, Julius had won after a long battle against the mutants, which then transformed into a battle against the chaotic spiral beam of fire and water. The beam battle had been a bit long, but considerably shorter than the one Selphira survived. Just minutes before leaving, Julius was certain he could escape and had decided on his next move. Zhao! He didn't need to say anything else. Chapter 956, Stubborn Tamer's Crisis, 2. Zhao was already positioned even against his true will. That was the quality Julius valued above almost everything else in someone in that line of work, the ability to process the situation at the same speed as the commander, to have already reached the same conclusion without being walked through it. Zhao read the group in seconds, who had flying beasts, who could carry an additional person without sacrificing the speed they'd need, which order minimized bottlenecks at the exit point, and organized the first wave out with the methodical efficiency of someone who had made these calculations in worse conditions than this and knew which variables actually mattered. Yes, take the faster ones and you go first, Julius told him. Zhao opened his mouth. It's not negotiable, Julius added. Zhao closed it again, with the expression of someone who disagrees but recognizes when the conversation is already over. When Julius had pushed a lot and was just a few meters from the exit, the frightened twins had already switched to their barrier and fled. Which, if Julius was honest, was a relief because it allowed him to conserve some of his energy, which would soon run out if he maintained the fusion much longer. So they emerged from the ruins with more energy reserves than he had expected. And Zhao was gone the next moment. Outside, Julius oriented himself and read the mutant flow. His group's Earth affinity gave him a natural sensitivity to the way large numbers of creatures moved across the ground, the pressure they exerted, the direction that pressure was building toward, and what he read stopped him for a moment. The flow was moving upward. Toward the massive bridge connecting Yino and Yano. Mutants without direction normally scattered. These weren't scattering. The line was deliberate and consistent, organized in a neat way that very likely didn't come from the creatures themselves. Julius traced it to its most probable destination and held that conclusion in his mind for a second before accepting it. They were crossing from Yino to Yano. He noted where Zhao had gone. The energy traces his beast's fusion left in the air were readable to anyone with sufficient mana sensitivity, and they pointed toward Goldcrest territory, the direction the twins had taken when they ran. Julius didn't yet know what the twins were about to do there or what their next move looked like, but Zhao had decided to follow their direction until its probable end in seconds, and Julius just trusted that kind of decision was good since it came from a scout that always understood without needing much explained to him. Zhao had even left someone shadowing the twins already, quiet and good for hiding from good senses, also fast. So tracking two people considerably slower than Zhao's flying group would be easy. That was enough for now. Julius moved toward the bridge. Earth tamers were rarely fast, and the beasts his group ran with were built for endurance and strength rather than speed of movement. But the bridge was considerably closer than Goldcrest territory, and crossing alongside the mutants, through the noise and mass of them rather than against it, turned out to need some specific techniques applied with patience. Earth had a long list of tricks for situations that looked impossible from a distance and merely difficult from up close. They arrived faster than he'd expected. The castle was still holding. Hundreds of fighters at the entrance to the vault, the marks of hours of sustained combat and slow retreat to the deeper zones of the castle visible in the way they stood and in how they managed their mana, that particular economy of movement that tamers developed when they knew they couldn't afford to spend anything beyond the strict minimum. Each use was measured against what remained and what was still coming. They were holding. But it was the kind of holding that had a deadline on it, and anyone who had spent enough time in long fights could read the deadline in the posture. Julius had arrived ready to be the relief. Then the mutant flow stopped. Not gradually. It stopped the way something stops when it receives an instruction, which is entirely different from how something stops when it runs out. Julius now knew the difference because he'd watched the corrupted mutants under the twins' control long enough underground to have formed clear opinions about how directed movement looked versus undirected movement. This was directed. Something had changed for the mind behind all this. Then the flow reversed direction. Julius felt the movement and tracked the new line, and the feeling that settled in his chest wasn't quite fear, but it shared enough characteristics with fear that he didn't waste time arguing about the distinction. The academy. He left a third of his group at the castle, just in case the mutants came back, and moved the rest. What Julius found when he reached the academy was not something he could have prepared for even with a warning. Maybe not even with full knowledge in advance. 8 artifacts had formed a structure in the center of the academy grounds, and his brain took several seconds to finish processing it, the kind of thing the eyes recognize before the mind accepts what it is actually seeing, that brief gap between perception and classification where the only available word is wrong. Wrong. There was no coherent anatomy to it. No logical reference point in anything Julius had studied or faced in combat, except maybe loosely a spider, and even that comparison broke down immediately when you considered the range of movement and what it was clearly capable of. The construct wasn't built around any principle he could name. But it was still built around a purpose, and the purpose was visible in how everything about it oriented toward a holding the figure above. It was elevating something. The energy emanating from that central point made the combined presence of every tamer on the field feel irrelevant by comparison. Julius had sensed the distortion from a distance, had felt it building as he approached, but the rate at which it had escalated since then sat at the edge of what he was willing to call alarming without sounding like someone who panicked easily. He was truly not someone who panicked easily. He was also not going to pretend the number was something other than what it was. In the elevated position, in the palm of what might generously be called one of the spider's hands, if you were willing to stretch the definition, stood something that didn't fit any prior category Julius had available. His father was the first thing that came to mind. Then the feeling arrived, and it was the complete opposite, and the power was much larger. Hybrid. Human, dragon, and corruption in one, and maybe something beyond all three that none of those terms fully reached. The entity stood at height, still, in a way that wasn't the stillness of someone waiting. It was the stillness of a process that hadn't finished yet. But that amount of energy. Something that large should have been felt from much farther away. Even from inside the ruins, from Goldcrest territory, Julius calculated that Zhao must have sensed it too, or would have by now. But he didn't know that this didn't work like ordinary mana. The dark energy radiating from the entity in the palm wasn't expanding outward the way energy always expanded, dispersing and thinning with distance. It was accumulating inward, pulling toward a central point that Julius could only perceive at all because of how close he now was, because it was actively interacting with the energy around it, drawing it in rather than pushing it out. Like a void that fed on everything within reach, growing more efficient the closer you came, the pull increasing with proximity in a way that suggested it wasn't close to finished. If you could feel it, that was only thanks to how plentiful it was. Even escaping the void's vicinity. And around that void, a wall of mutants moved in a continuous churning mass, channeling into the center with the single-minded consistency of something that had surrendered any individual direction. Not attacking but feeding and defending. Delivering what they had to what was accumulating above them with the blind momentum of a current that no longer needed anyone to sustain it. Julius assessed his reserves. They weren't enough to make a difference here. Maybe they wouldn't have been enough at full capacity. That wasn't pessimism. It was simple arithmetic. Then his heart lurched. He saw the girls in front of the entity. All three of them in maximum fusion, though Lyra looked like she was forcing hers just a second on mana fumes. Luna and Larissa's stances had that particular quality of people who had already decided something and were past the point where additional information was going to change it. Julius moved forward without calculating the odds further. But he already knew he wouldn't reach them in time. Chapter 957, Stubborn Tamer's Crisis, 3. Luckily, Lynn was at the front. She was the reason Julius sprinted as hard as he could but didn't break into a desperate scream immediately. Her posture said something specific to him, not holding position, not waiting for a better moment. Power accumulating. He recognized the preparation a half-second before he understood what technique she was loading into it, and when he understood, something in his assessment of risk shifted. They weren't trying to escape, they were attacking. Power finally exploded and the kick landed against the mass of hundreds of mutants and disintegrated the nearest ones in the immediate impact zone. But the impact wasn't the point. The real function followed a fraction of a second later, a pulse of compressed air that drove outward from the point of contact and displaced everything in a 20-meter arc that wasn't anchored to the ground. It wasn't the damage to the mutants who were already dying anyway that mattered. It was the gap it opened between the mutants, that momentary separation between bodies to allow a clear view that lasted exactly long enough for the three girls to all point at the same spot. The beam that left them was the closest thing to an adequate answer that Julius had seen since arriving. Light and darkness wound together with spiritual energy, technically covering the widest spectrum available to the three of them, synchronized with a precision that only comes from their fusion augmentations pushing their awareness to their ceiling combined with extended practice and the specific clarity that urgent necessity produces. Everything they had, directed at the figure above, released as a single unified attempt. Julius held his breath. The entity didn't move. Still locked in whatever process the transformation required, still building toward whatever it was becoming. The beam made contact with its chest. And disappeared. Gone inside of the void. Absorbed, but not the way a shield absorbs an impact, with resistance and dispersion and residual energy that has to redirect somewhere. It was absorbed the way nothing Julius had ever seen was absorbed. No visible effort, no residue, and no indication at all that the impact had registered against a process already in motion. The figure above didn't move. The energy point at the center of the structure kept accumulating. Julius looked at the girls and saw in their stances what he had hoped not to see. Not surrender, none of the three were people who stood like that. But the recognition that what they had just used was the best they had, and the best they had hadn't been enough. The specific exhaustion that follows maximum output with no result is different from any other kind of exhaustion, and he knew what it looked like. Suddenly, the energy they had launched, which seemed to have disappeared, reappeared in the entity's chest and began to spin. To transform into something different. Wrong. Then the entity extended its hand and directed it toward them. Julius closed his fists. He wasn't going to reach them in time. He assessed what he had left. Assessed what was around him. Assessed the distance, the angle, the realistic probability that anything he could do from his current position changed what was unfolding in the center of that field. The numbers didn't work out. But Julius Dravenholm was the son of a man who had thrown himself forward without hesitation to save others. One way or another, he was going to reach them. Moments earlier, Ren closed his fists. The faint light the mushroom had left in his chest was still there, quiet and low, like the last ember of a fire that has gone to sleep but hasn't quite finished burning. Not gone. Just resting at the bottom of something that still had a warmth. The jade gold roots had returned to their place. The crack was a fraction smaller than it had been. And the words that had come through that thick wall still rang in him with enough clarity that they weren't going anywhere, the kind of clarity that comes not from volume but from the dear memory something important is said. To push out these intruders, you already know what you have to do. That uncomfortable's feeling. He knew what it felt like. He had been subconsciously avoiding pushing to that direction directly since the first time Lyra's fire had burned him. But it was indeed something that pushed back and spread outward, burning something that was inside his mind and felt wrong in a weird way that only intrusive thoughts feel wrong. This feeling was not corrupted wrong. Not Celthia's version of wrong. The other kind. The kind that worked and let him move. Celthia was on the floor at the far side of what had been the library. Or what remained of the library's architecture. The walls still stood, the ceiling was still the correct height, the angle of the floor was still what it had always been. The bones of the space were intact. Everything else, the shelves, the books, the accumulated evidence of everything that had once been stored and accessible here, was simply gone. It was the shape of a library with nothing in it, which had been somehow worse than a different kind of emptiness entirely. She had come to crash against the back wall. The space was smaller than normal, which meant that when the mushroom's pulse had driven her across it, the wall had arrived sooner than it might have. She was examining her shoulder with the careful, slightly detached attention of someone assessing minor damage to something they care about, but not panicked or angry yet. Just evaluating. The expression on her face turned to irritation. The specific, slightly absurd kind of irritation that comes not from pain but from indignity. There's at least one small advantage to a space this small, she said, rotating the shoulder once and apparently deciding it was fine. When you go flying, the wall is close to hit you again. A pause, dry as dust. I'm not sure it's worth it, honestly. It hurt my ego more than anything else. Think you'd win with just that? Ren didn't answer. He also didn't have time to answer, because the moment he started actually listening to her was the moment he was doing exactly what she wanted, which was staying inside his own mental space 1 minute longer than necessary while she worked out whatever she was working out. He had learned enough about how she operated in the last few minutes to know that her commentary was never just commentary. It was a hand keeping the door open. So he came at her instead. The first second confirmed what he already knew but what his body needed a moment to accept as operational reality. He could move but without his beasts, without any of the bonuses they provided, without anything except 15 years of physical conditioning and the principles Lin had drilled into every muscle he had. He was not weak, but he was not strong against a Tamer of her caliber either. He had a well-trained young body. Against most problems a Tamer his age faced, that was enough to matter when everyone would have small buffs still. In a normal situation 10 years ago, against a girl his age with his level of training, he had a real chance. But Ren would do much worse in his city and even more in the academy. His spread knowledge had redefined that, what a 15-year-old Tamer was supposed to look like. But at least in Yino it would be a bit less changed. For someone frozen in time, even worse. This girl should be far from a gold-rank beast. But even so, Celthia was not most problems. He didn't know how different she was, how anomalous. With the corruption using her as main body, she could even be as weird as him. And maybe it was so since when Ren reached her, she slipped the punch without leaving the wall. A minimal lateral adjustment, precisely calibrated, the margin so exact that his fist passed through the same space her face had occupied a half-second earlier with nothing to show for it. Not a full dodge. Just enough movement to make him miss, applied with the economy of someone who likely saw him in slow motion. Then she hit him. The claw arrived before Ren finished processing that the dodge was over. Purple diamond crystallization, the same technique he carried in his own arsenal, recognizable in structure the moment he felt it, except that Celsius had that corrupted undertone that changed not just the color but the texture. Bigger and heavier claws. The corrupted variant of the same Hydra he used, wearing a different coat over the same bones. The impact sent him across the room. He traveled, hit the floor already rolling, and ended up flat on his back staring at the ceiling of what had been the library's reference section, a detail his brain supplied with complete uselessness given the circumstances. Chapter 958, Taming His Core, 3. Ren lay there for a moment taking notes of the damage. Spat blood. Not much, just enough to confirm that the hit had been real in every sense that mattered, that this space translated force the same way the outside world did, and also that his ribs were going to have opinions about this later. Celthea had gotten to her feet. She watched him from across the empty floor with something that in another person would have read as amusement, but in her carried that particular quality of someone observing an experiment that is producing results worth noting. That nice body of yours doesn't do much for you in here, so lovely yet useless, you know. Not cruel or mocking tone. Just like a data point she was sharing, monotone the way someone mentions the weather before deciding whether to bring a coat. Ren wiped the corner of his mouth and stood up. He breathed. Not because the oxygen mattered, in this space that was a concept open to debate, but because he needed the 2 seconds it took to do it correctly. Full breath in, slow breath out. The kind Lin had made him practice until it was reflex, back when he thought it was just a breathing exercise and before he understood it was the reset button she was actually installing. It wasn't useless. Lin's first rule. Build the foundation. Her voice had that quality of something you hear and accept before the first real weeks of training convince you it isn't what you thought, and then you come out the other side of it and realize it was always exactly what she said. The body is the foundation that everything else sits on. Without a real foundation, the bonuses have a low ceiling. It's not just the bonus that matters. It's what the bonus is multiplying. Ren looked at his chest. The mushroom's light was still there, faint, slowly reconstructing the casing around the seed. His first beast needed to sleep. He had understood that. Forcing it again would be the kind of mistake that didn't get corrected easily, the kind you paid for in a currency that wasn't just mana. But the energy the mushroom had released in that pulse hadn't simply vanished. It was still in the space around him, loose and available, carrying the particular signature of something that had been his for long enough that he recognized it the way he recognized his own voice. He breathed it in the way he'd learned to breathe in, not grabbing for it, just opening the channel and letting it find him. The first bonus of his first beast opened. 10% strength, just grabbing at the edges of his full power, barely enough to notice from the outside. Not what he needed. But more than he'd had 30 seconds ago. He came at her again. This time Celthea registered the difference before he arrived. He saw it in the small postural adjustment she made as he closed the distance, worry, a shift in weight, a slight change in how her hands were positioned, the half-second where her expression moved from passive observation to something closer to active attention. She had noticed. Same pattern of attack. But this time he dodged her counter. Plenty of strength and speed, he said. But your technique is 0 and your movement has huge gaps. Ren didn't stop moving. There are many more important variables, he said, breathing through the sentence. My teacher covers all of them. Celthea blinked just once. The single visible sign that the answer had landed somewhere she hadn't expected it. You're faster than before, she conceded. But only by a margin, you shouldn't be able to. Another dodge positioned him at the perfect angle for a clean shot to the liver. His fist drove toward it with the full commitment of someone who had set that opening up. The punch landed. And did nothing. The purple diamond scales absorbed the impact without acknowledgement, without so much as a sound. Like hitting a mountain. Ren felt it before his fist had fully extended, felt the density in the instant of contact and was already pulling the arm back, but that moment of adjustment cost him. Her counter arrived while he was still between positions. He covered, barely, but the blow caught his side and drove him back several meters. He had already turned with the impact instead of bracing against it, converting the force into directional movement, bleeding off momentum through rotation rather than absorption. He landed on his feet, not elegantly, but controlled. Still standing. He stood there, breathing, and let the unpleasant sensation of the spiritual fire build in his chest. The feeling that wasn't comfortable. The feeling that worked in his favor. The bronze bonuses opened. A small golden mushroom bloomed at the top of his head, barely there, and the energy that had been circulating found its natural channels and followed them without needing permission. Faster. Stronger. Not doubled, nothing so dramatic, but enough that the space between him and Celthea felt different. He could feel the gap in his own reflexes closing slightly at the edges. He went back at her. Celthea laughed while she defended. A genuine sound, not mockery nor the polished amusement she deployed when she wanted to unsettle someone, but the unguarded laugh of a person who is enjoying themselves in a way they hadn't anticipated. Ren kept pushing, kept looking for the angle that would make the scales matter less than the body behind them, and every time he found what looked like an opening, the diamond absorbed it without complaint. Ren processed it and changed what he was trying to do. He couldn't damage her through the scales. That was a fact, at least for now. Accepting facts quickly was one of the things Lin insisted on, because the tamers who argued with facts in the middle of a fight were the ones who got hurt by them twice. But scales were a static defensive system. They weren't a balance system. They weren't a reaction system. A tamer covered in armor was well protected against being hit, and significantly less protected against being moved. Feints. He had already moved. 2 feints, one setting up the other, each one committed enough that they read as genuine attempts, because Lin had taught him that a feint nobody believes is just a really bad punch, and the only feint worth throwing is one you're willing to follow through on if the read is wrong. Celthea took the bait on the first and broke her stance on the second. Her weight shifted to cover the anticipated angle. Ren went low. The leg sweep caught her before she could redistribute weight. She went down, and Ren was already there before she even finished falling, his hands finding her ankles, back muscles engaging, using the momentum of her own fall and adding to it with a full rotation that carried her in a wide arc over his head. The sound she made when she hit the floor of the empty library was extremely satisfying. Ren chose not to say that out loud. Celthea was down for approximately 1 second. She lay there with an expression he hadn't seen on her face yet, not the cold analysis, not the observation or that dry amusement. This was something more direct. The irritation of someone who has just had something done to them that they hadn't calculated for, and who considers that gap in their calculation a personal problem. Fine, she said. In a tone that had nothing fine about it. She didn't transform all at once. That would almost have been easier to digest. Instead she did it the way that was somehow worse, gradually, methodically, each layer added with the deliberation of someone who has options and is working through them from the bottom up. The scales extended further. The musculature beneath them shifted, not just the surface but the underlying structure, bones and tendons resettling into something built for a different weight class entirely. Her posture changed. The way she occupied the space she was standing in changed. When she came at him this time, the speed was different by enough margin that the technique he had been running arrived half a second late. He didn't have the reaction time to close that gap. The hit caught him with the full weight of what she was now delivering directly into him. Ren didn't try to turn it into anything. He went to the floor, bounced once, and lay still for a moment staring at the ceiling again, which was becoming a familiar view. He breathed again. Annoyance wasn't helping with that uncomfortable feeling. 2 sensations that together didn't soften anything. But he embraced it. And underneath it, something steadier, the part of him that Lin had spent years building past the point where pain could reach it. More mushrooms bloomed along the top of his head, small and golden, appearing with the quiet logic of a system that recognized what the situation required and responded to it. The silver rank bonuses of his mushroom opened with a fraction of those of his other beasts, each one settling into place the way something settles when it belongs there. More strength. More speed. Not dramatic yet, like a transformation. Just the next rung of the ladder, made available because the foundation underneath it was solid enough to hold it. The difference, when he got to his feet, was real. Chapter 959, Taming His Core, 4. Cynthia was looking at Ren with a face expression that had moved past the point of fun into exasperated. "That's a mistake," she said. The tone was different now, not the dry amusement she had been deploying since the start of this, not the careful observation. Something more direct, stripped of performance and with the particular calm of someone saying what they actually believe but still not especially caring whether the other person accepts it. "What you're doing right now? Letting that thing help you is bad." Ren didn't respond. "The gold wants to play the good one." Cynthia tilted her head slightly. "But it's deceiving you, so you think we're the ones doing the deceiving. Because it wants exactly the same thing as what you call corruption." A pause. "What they unfairly call corruption." Ren closed his fists. "The difference is that we're more honest about it," she continued. Her voice still had that calm, even when everything else around her was in motion. "Your false beast plants seeds, cultivates them, directs them toward where it wants them to grow. And when they're large enough..." She opened one hand in a gesture that was almost elegant, the crystallized fingers spreading slowly, "It will harvest them. The same as us, just with fewer varieties of modification and apparently a better public image." Her eyes held his. "Let us give you the power to free yourself from an ending you won't be able to enjoy. Let us save you." If it was a lie, it wasn't a simple one. That was the most uncomfortable part. Ren knew it the moment he heard it, and the knowing arrived from two directions at once. He watched for fluctuation in the mana and found none, and underneath that, the part of him that processed logical information at inconvenient moments, the part that had never once agreed to be quiet when he needed it to, turned the words over and found weight in them. There was something in what she had said that he couldn't dismiss cleanly, a thread of something real woven into it tightly enough that pulling the lie out would take the truth with it. But it wasn't the complete truth either. It was too ambiguous for that. A half-truth used as a door left half open, waiting for him to step through. "You might be right about some things," said Ren. Cynthia raised one eyebrow. "But right now the only thing I'm interested in is getting you out of here, and you're distracting me so." He came at her. Something had changed. Cynthia had noticed it before he said a word. The way he moved was different, not simply faster in the straightforward sense of velocity increased, but recalibrated, as though Ren had quietly revised his internal map of where he ended and the fight began. She registered the shift not as a single observable thing but as a collection of small things that added up to a conclusion. But he was already close, so she attacked. The strike found only air. Cynthia's expression tightened for a fraction of a second before it smoothed back to neutral. She threw another. Ren didn't retreat, he moved laterally, stepping into the angle that left her committed to the momentum of the swing, and the purple diamond claw raked across the empty floor of the library and found nothing. She tried again. More velocity this time, more mass behind it, increasing the fusion because when a technique stopped producing results the obvious answer was to escalate the force driving it. She pressed harder and moved faster and the outcome was the same. Ren had read her movements and was simply no longer where she had aimed. His three beasts' powers had started filtering back in. Not at full strength, nothing close to what they would have been under normal conditions, but enough that each exchange left her in a slightly worse position than the one before it. Small deficits accumulating. The mushroom's power kept flowing from the faint pulsing light at the center of the space, steady and unhurried, and Ren absorbed it without forcing it, letting it find its own channels the way water finds the lowest resistance path. Cynthia pushed her fusion further. More bestial, more speed, more strength, the transformation deepening as she committed more to it. The empty architecture of the library began vibrating from the weight of two presences that kept escalating, the space between them shrinking and expanding in rapid sequences as they moved. But for a good while now, Ren didn't take a single hit. Somewhere between the 15th and 20th attempt, he started laughing. Not the laugh of someone enjoying themselves in a comfortable way. The specific laugh that comes when a person suddenly understands something, and the satisfaction of understanding it is enough that the laugh escapes before any decision is made about whether to let it out. "You'd be better off leaving on your own," he said, slipping from another strike with a rotation that was almost unnecessarily smooth. "Otherwise I'm going to have to make this unpleasant while I push you out." Cynthia stopped. "You're getting overconfident." Her tone carried the weight of a reminder, the reminder that less than 5 minutes ago she had sent him across the room. A moment ago. Ren shrugged. "Things change." Cynthia came at him with genuine focus this time. Ren cleared her path with enough margin that the motion looked unhurried, reappeared at her side, and instead of hitting the armor he placed his fingers with perfect accuracy at the thinnest gap between the plates on her abdomen, the exact point where, if you could perceive the mana pattern of a Tamer clearly enough, one of the primary flow nodes sat closest to the surface. It was the same technique he had worked out with Larissa once. Refined again with Luna after that. Find the pattern, find the node, disrupt the flow before the system can compensate for the interruption. Cynthia didn't have the same flow pattern. The corrupted system was mutated, rerouted in ways that weren't standard, built around different principles. She wasn't Larissa. She wasn't Luna. Who would have thought that a disrupted mana flow in a projected entity from a crystallized body would feel like being tickled? Chapter 960, Taming His Core, 5. Ren was confused. What happened was difficult to categorize precisely. Cynthia folded. Ren's first interpretation was pain. That reading lasted approximately 3 seconds, which was the time it took to register that the sound Cynthia was making wasn't the sound a person made when something hurt. It didn't have the right shape for pain. It was involuntary and sharp, yeah, but broken at the edges. It seemed to be the kind of sound that escapes when the body produces it before the mind can decide whether to allow it. A weird sound he also had never heard coming from someone with a doubled voice and this degree of mutation. But he wasn't going to let himself be distracted just to process what it actually was. Not right now. She straightened with visible effort, pulling herself back together. "Stop or I'll explode." "Don't pretend," said Ren, pushing his hands to the front as she kept backing up. "I figured it out a while ago." Cynthia looked at him from her position. Her expression was genuinely difficult to read, the first time in this entire encounter that her face had stopped giving him something legible to work with. But still. "I figured out that you can't use complete abilities in this space." Ren kept moving forward, with the particular steadiness of someone who has reached a conclusion and tested it enough times to be sure of it. "My mushroom's roots limit what your corruption can do in here. The rift? If you can't expand it further, your power doesn't scale even with that extreme fusion. So all that escalation you've been doing, it's almost purely cosmetic." Cynthia opened her mouth. "Part of me is still CRYST." She started. "Not interested." Ren extended his hand toward another flow node. "Wait, listen." Cynthia took a step back, but the empty library wasn't large and the wall arrived sooner than expected. She pressed against it. "There's a human part that's Sep." He touched the node. The sound Cynthia made this time was even less compatible with suffering than the previous one. High-pitched, entirely involuntary, ending in a short exhale that she clearly had not planned to produce. It had a very specific quality to it that did not match any of the sounds a person made when something was genuinely wrong with them. Ren considered this data point carefully. "Wait. Every time I touch here," he said, adopting the measured tone he used when testing a hypothesis in real time, "the flow partially interrupts. It's a fairly effective seal, honestly." He paused, arriving at the conclusion his observations had been pointing toward for the last 30 seconds. Maybe that's what pushing her out of here sounds like. "Ren." Cynthia's voice had a new register. Not threatening. Something closer to the warning of a person whose patience is running out at an accelerating rate. "Stop. Why should I listen to you? You're the one who came in without permission." Another touch. Another involuntary sound. "Besides, I'm only interrupting the flow. If it bothers you that much, just leave on your own and—" "I said stop." Ren snapped his fingers. I'm not falling for your noisy distractions. It's time to purge the evil. He paused. Wei would say the correct pedagogical approach is repeated practice until the pattern corrects itself, so. What followed was, from Ren's perspective, approximately 3 minutes of methodical flow disruption applied across several secondary nodes while Celthea produced a varied range of sounds that he continued cataloging as manifestations of energetic discomfort. From any other perspective it would have been categorized differently. Celthea, who understood her own situation with considerably more precision than Ren did, reached a limit. It wasn't a gradual decision. It was the kind of decision that gets made when the alternative is to remain on the floor being purified by a 15-year-old who is thoroughly convinced he is performing an exorcism, and who greets every involuntary sound she produces as confirmation that his theory is correct. Enough, she said. Very quietly. The tone was unlike every one that had come before it. The cold analysis was gone. The dry humor she had been using as distance was gone. It was just the voice of someone who had finished having patience with a situation, stripped of everything else, carrying only what it needed to carry. The corrupted energy that had been accumulating around the incomplete artifact since she first entered this space converged all at once. Celthea deformed when it hit her. Not the way a Tamer activates a fusion, not with the deliberation of someone choosing a shape, selecting a form and stepping into it. This was closer to a directionless explosion, her body losing its boundaries and expanding outward toward every point of the interior space simultaneously, the edges of her dissolving into something that had no recognizable form left. What remained was a network, vast and dark, occupying the entire volume of what had been the library. Every wall. Every corner. Every inch of space between them. Ren was at the center of it. Having been so close to the epicenter, the threads closed around him before he could react. Not a grip in any conventional sense, a web of roots that resembled the ones in his own chest, but made of corrupted energy in its most concentrated form, wrapping him from every angle at once. There was no direction to run because every direction was equally occupied until the walls. He pulled. He turned. He applied everything he had available in terms of strength and technique, trying to find a gap in the threads, a point where the tension was lighter. The threads didn't give. Then the corrupted flow started arriving again. It wasn't an attack. It was forced feeding, the kind that was designed to produce a fusion, a monstrous unification of two similar forces, a metamorphosis built from the outside in. Corruption entering his ethereal body from every point of contact simultaneously, converging toward the crack in his chest with that familiar pleasant sensation that Ren already knew and that remained exactly as difficult to resist as the first time, the false freedom, the power without a ceiling, the promise that what was coming next was what should have always been. Chapter 961, Taming His Core, Unison. It didn't matter that Ren recognized the feeling. Recognition and resistance were not the same thing. He reached for Lyra. The memory of her fire, that sensation that burned in the painful but correct way, that pushed back against the wrong kind of feeling and replaced it with the right kind. But this time the quantity was different. A fierce pain arrived before he had time to prepare for it. Not the pain of Lyra's spiritual fire, which was clean even when it was intense. This was the pain of an absurd quantity of corruption being resisted without a channel wide enough to expel it, accumulating in the same nodes he had been disrupting so calmly just minutes ago, backing up against the resistance his body was trying to maintain, finding nowhere to go and pressing harder in every direction. Ren screamed. The sound filled the interior space with a volume he had never let go outside, where his physical body was still held inside the veil of darkness in the artifact's grip, about to be struck by a powerful combined triple beam. The energy kept coming. Outside, what Julius and the girls saw was the convergence, every mutant that had been scattered across the academy grounds now running in circles around him and funneling their energy toward the center of the 8 artifact structure, a dense black power accumulating in the core of the construct. A power dense enough that the temperature of the surrounding air dropped, not for any conventional thermal reason, but because of what that much concentrated energy did to the senses of the Tamer around it. Inside, Ren felt that volume as pressure from every angle at once. He kept resisting. Not because he had a strategy but because it was the only thing he could do, and letting himself be a toy of corruption was not a thing he was willing to consider while his lungs still had air in them. Yet the pain was insane. Maybe he was already done. Then something happened outside that pulled his attention out of the pain for an instant. Celthia's command arrived through the network, slow, like information traveling through a medium that was thicker than it should be. Ren felt it too, the instruction forming and moving outward, past the network, toward the artifact, toward the girls who were still trying to find an opening in the transformation process. Attack them. Ren disagreed mightily strongly. Fighting the command together with the corruption hurt too much to describe. But he kept resisting. Every second of resistance was a second the command took longer to execute in the external body, delayed past the timing Celthia had wanted it to be. So the girls got their attack off in time. But it wasn't enough to stop the transformation. The beam struck the convergence point and seemed to be absorbed, so Celthia registered it as a victory. The energy spent, she assumed, would simply feed the process further. Then it entered the vortex. That weird beam. Not a single element or a common combination. Something that carried the essence of Lyra's fire, the density of Luna's shadow, and the clarity of Larissa's light, except that it wasn't any of those three things separately. It was a new thing, the thing the three of them formed when they arrived at the same point at the same moment without a prior plan for what it would become. The energy spun in the vortex of corruption for a moment. Then it entered the center where Ren was. What happened next had no category in the mana theory Ren or Celthia knew. The energies that had been pulling everything toward chaos found a structure to organize around. Corrupted in the way corruption always was, permeating, seeping into every gap, but also purifying now, embracing, spiritual, all of them turning in the same cycle, each one finding its position in a pattern that none of them could have formed alone. The extraordinary nature of it pulled Ren's attention away from his resistance. Just for a moment. Just long enough. So outside, Celthia's command was finally executed. The shadow of the external entity Ren had become raised its hand and struck toward the girls with what should have been concentrated corruption. Yet what reached them was something else. It didn't encroach them as contamination. It recognized them. The impact connected them to the interior space instead of consuming them, the bond traced by something that carried their signatures already mixed with Ren's in proportions that the corrupted mana network hadn't calculated, couldn't have calculated, because those proportions had never existed in a spiritual form, a form it couldn't have anticipated. Lin was the exception. The explosion sent her backward with the clean force of an impact that formed no connection, because Lin had not combined her energy with Ren's, but Julius caught her before she reached the ground. He had been running to help from the moment the situation started coming apart, calculating trajectories, keeping track of everyone at once. Inside, the familiar energies entered the vortex. Their minds came with them. Ren recognized them. They were warm in a known human way, the warmth of things you know so well they no longer feel external, because they aren't. They had always been at the perimeter of what he was, forming the edge of something that had no precise name but that existed regardless of whether anyone named it. He felt the shape of each one clearly, Lyra's urgency, Luna's steadiness, Larissa's directness. All of them present. The pain of holding that much energy was still there. But it was a benign pain now. He embraced it. Lyra's energy burned with its full intensity. He accepted it. Luna's shadow cut with a coldness that wasn't hostile, just honest about what it was. He accepted that too. Larissa's light didn't ask permission before it started cleaning what it found. He accepted it the same way. The interior space came back to him. Not gradually. All at once, the way something returns when it was never entirely gone and was only waiting for someone to take hold of it again. Ren's jade gold network expanded and took the energy Celthia's had been built from, so she got fragmented, collapsing back into her human shape, semi-translucent now, her form diminished and unsteady on the floor of the space. The empty library transformed into a chamber surrounded by golden roots. Ren stood at the center, bare as he had been at the start, though at least now covered in his diamond armor. Celthia was on the floor just in front of him, wearing the same expression she'd had the first time the mushroom launched her into the wall, except that this time something that could be called exhaustion had settled into her too perfect features. She was already fading at the edges. She would disappear from his interior soon. Ren exhaled and finally relaxed. But then he noticed something else. The interior space, which had been exclusively his for as long as he had any memory of it, now held 3 additional presences. 3 very specific presences. And all 3 of them were looking at him. In a very particular situation. How could you abuse me like that? Celthea seemed about to cry. Chapter 962, Fractionated Tamer. Celthea was not going to take long to fade. But it was a gradual process. Like ink dissolving in water, the edges of her figure were losing definition while Ren's interior space slowly reclaimed its golden quality, patient and inexorable. Her features were still visible. Still readable. The expression on them was something Ren didn't manage to catalogue in time. "You were very rough with me," said Celthea, with that tone of hers that skipped dramatic inflection entirely and landed somewhere in the register of calm observation, someone stating a fact they find mildly interesting. "Touching me all over like that was cruel." A deliberate pause cleaning an unexisting tear. Though honestly, her lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile but occupied the same neighborhood, it didn't feel that bad. A new sensory experience. Ren opened his mouth. He closed it. Not because he had no answer. He had an answer? Several, in fact. The problem was that every version of that answer he could formulate in the next 2 seconds was going to sound exactly like the thing it wasn't, and 2 seconds was precisely how much time he had before the 3 girls reached his back. He felt them before he turned. When he did, Larissa was already just 3 steps away. She moved with that efficiency she had when she had finished evaluating a situation and settled on her next step, no additional processing time required. Even when the context made composure a genuine effort. Her eye swept the space once, the floor, where the traces of the corrupted network had left their marks on the golden surface. From the floor to Celthea, from Celthea to Ren, and from Ren back out to the general situation. The full picture assembled and filed under a category Ren recognized immediately as Larissa arriving at uncomfortable conclusions. She stopped in front of him and put a hand on his shoulder. Ren drew breath to explain that it wasn't what it looked like, but she got there first. "If you want a 4th, said Larissa, with a calm that was somehow more unsettling than outrage would have been, "you'll need to discuss it with us first." The air left Ren without permission. He deflated completely. He hadn't prepared a response for that, because preparing a response for that would have required anticipating it, and anticipating it would have required a level of imagination that he refused to credit himself with. The response he had ready was for indignation, or for questions, or for any reasonable variation of what the situation looked like from the outside. Not for that specific calm, the kind that meant Larissa had processed the complete picture and arrived at a conclusion that didn't make sense for him. He looked for Lyra. She was 2 steps further back. Her face had the look of someone whose body had finally sent in the bill for everything they'd spent over the last few hours, very tired but arriving while there were still important things left to deal with. She exhaled slowly, the breath of someone preparing to say something they already know isn't going to be enough. "I don't agree," she said. "For the record. 3 is already a problem for me. Lyra, this isn't. I'm not saying I won't accept it in some fair agreement." She cut him off with the same tired energy. "I'm saying it's a problem. Those are different things." Ren opened his mouth to explain that nothing they were constructing had any basis in what had actually occurred. That there was a technical explanation for every element of the scene. That disrupting mana flow through secondary nodes was a perfectly documented combat technique, one that the sounds a projected entity made when its corrupted flow was interrupted were a natural physiological response to. A laugh didn't let him start. Not from the girls. Celthea, still dissolving at the edges, had clearly decided to make full use of her remaining time. She was watching the scene with the first expression of genuine amusement Ren had seen from her since she'd entered his interior space, relaxed, open, like someone settling in to enjoy something they hadn't expected to find entertaining. "After everything he made me feel," she said, addressing all 3 girls with a comfort level that Ren found profoundly unfair given the timing, "he can't escape responsibility now." Her eyes moved to him with something that in a different context might have been called flirtatious, and in this one was specifically engineered to make his life difficult. I'm keeping him for myself. So he can make me feel things like that every day. I'm not sharing. A brief pause. I don't understand how any of you could. That is completely. Ren started. Celthia's body finished dissolving. Mid-sentence. Without letting him even finish. He stood there with his mouth open, looking at the spot where she had been a moment ago, which was now just an empty section of the Golden Library. He closed his mouth. Opened it again. Closed it again. He turned slowly toward the girls. All three of them were looking at him. Larissa with that composure of hers that had depth behind it, which made it harder to read than simple indignation, because you couldn't be sure what the depth contained. Lyra with the face of someone adding new data to an already complicated social calculation and watching the results update in real time. And Luna. Luna, who had taken a step forward. Who had put both hands on his shoulders. Who was holding him with a firm grip that maybe wasn't aggressive, not exactly, but that still didn't factor in the possibility of him going anywhere. Her grip was unyielding in the way that meant the person doing the gripping had been thinking about not letting go for a while before something happened. Ren registered her mana in the first second of contact because it was impossible not to. The surface was quiet, controlled, carrying that particular serenity Luna used as insulation between what was happening outside and whatever was happening underneath. But beneath that surface the mana was a full vortex. Complex and enormous, the complete storm of someone who had spent a period of time not knowing whether the person in front of them was going to still be that person when it was over. He looked at her. She looked back at him. He thought that the most reasonable course of action was to explain everything, calmly and in order. That maybe after the shouting and the scolding, once he could show them the actual state of the mana in his core, they would see that there was nothing to understand in the wrong way. That the truth was simple even if it sounded complicated. That Celthia had said exactly what she'd said to produce exactly this situation, and that the three of them were too intelligent not to see through that if he gave them 30 seconds. He opened his mouth. Luna pulled him in. Chapter 963, Chapters 963, Taming Stress. Luna didn't punish him. It was a hug. But her arms were a bit stronger than expected for someone who had no intention of hurting him. He still hadn't anticipated it, and so he didn't have time to decide how to react before he was already there, his face against her hair, her arms locked around his back with the persistence of someone who has been waiting to do something for long enough that when they finally can, they don't measure the force. The side of her face pressed into his chest. Ren deflated for the second time in under a minute. Luna was crying. Not the dramatic kind. The quiet kind, the kind that comes out when someone has been holding something back long enough that when it finally goes, it goes without warning or control. He felt the dampness against his chest before he fully processed what it was. He stood there for roughly 2 seconds with no idea what to do with his hands. Then he put them where they made sense. One against the back of her head, careful, and one flat against her back. A hug he hadn't planned that, once started, had nowhere better to be. Larissa cleared her throat. She's right, she said, with the tone of someone who has reviewed a conclusion and decided to stand by it. We can't trust what an enemy says. Her words sounded credible, but they were deliberately vague. The most reasonable interpretation is that she was trying to create division so we'd be easier to target afterward. Staying together is the logical response. Ren caught movement at the edge of his vision. Larissa joined the hug from his side with the same composure she brought to everything else, as though embracing Ren while Luna cried into his chest was a tactical decision that happened to coincide with many other considerations, a logical response to the situation that she had evaluated and found sound. The warmth of the two of them wrapped around him from different angles of his almost bare body. Ren's face went red. He turned his head toward Lyra, who was still in her position from before, wearing that complicated expression she got when feelings were stacked on top of each other and hadn't yet found the right order to be processed in. That Celthia girl was just causing trouble. The words came out fast, because if he didn't say them fast they weren't going to come out cleanly. What I was doing wasn't strange the way she made it sound. It was flow disruption through the secondary nodes, which is a combat technique that actually. Lyra extended one finger. She placed it on his lips. Ren stopped. Celthia, I don't care. What I'm thinking about, said Lyra, her voice quieter than usual, and what's been worrying me, isn't any of that. A pause. Her eyes had the quality they got when she decided to say something that actually mattered and had dropped the wrapping she normally used to make important things easier to hear. I didn't need to hear any explanation to know I was relieved you were still you. Ren said nothing more. For the record, Lyra added, pulling in a slow breath the way someone does when they're consciously setting something aside, I have things to process. A lot of things about all of this. A loose gesture that took in the interior space, the spot where Celthia had been, everything that had happened. But that can wait. She exhaled. This can't. She joined the hug. Ren ended up surrounded on three sides with enough warmth that the interior space of the empty library, which had spent the last several minutes serving as the setting for too many things that were too intense, stopped feeling like a battlefield. It was strange. Strange in a sense that didn't fit any classification system he had built for the many implausible things that happened to him. Not uncomfortable, not exactly. Not completely comfortable either. Something that existed between the two, something without a name but that also didn't urgently need one. Maybe a happy mistake, he thought. It was the word that came closest. He wanted to say it was indeed a good thing. He wanted to say something to all three of them, because there was something more important than the strange girl, there was something he'd understood better during his brief contact with his sleeping mushroom, a glimpse into the vast depth of information it now contained at gold rank, things about the crystallization and the problems surrounding them that he hadn't seen clearly before. He wanted to put it into words. To tell them he understood more now. To reaffirm, out loud, that he was going to help them, that the warmth they were giving him right now was something he intended to return with positive actions, in the only way he actually knew how to return things. He opened his mouth. His eyes closed. It wasn't a decision. The body took over when the mind had been running at overcapacity for too long without giving it a say. The exterior battle. The interior battle. Celthia and the mushroom and the roots and the bonuses and the vortex and the pain and the three of them entering the center of everything at the precise moment when he had nothing left to hold himself up with, not alone. Too much time under too much pressure, the kind of massive load that doesn't let your body announce when it's done, it just stops, and you go with it. He tried to open them. He genuinely tried. If he couldn't tell them what he wanted to tell them, he at least wanted to know that everything outside was handled. The mutants. The artifact. Lin, his parents, the others. Whether the situation had shifted or whether there was still something he could do from where he was. But his legs went first. The girls caught him before he fell, before the fall became disorganized and took him all the way to the floor without any control. They brought him down together with the kind of coordination that doesn't require anyone to say anything, because it comes from the same concern arriving at the same moment. Chapter 964, Taming Stress, 2. They settled him onto the floor of the interior space, and Ren held onto all three of them with what remained of what he had, which was very little, his face saying in silence everything he hadn't been able to say in words. Something the girls had already understood, there was no way a body and a mind pushed so hard until arriving in that state had anything to be ashamed of. It was impossible to believe Celthia, to believe anything negative about him, when the evidence of how hard he had been pushing was right there in his face, in the weight of him, in the way he had been fighting to hold on a few more minutes just to check that everyone else was all right. The girls watched him go quiet. And in their look there was not even a small doubt. Some time passed before any of the three spoke. Larissa was first. He's carrying too much. She didn't say it as an accusation, she said it with the meticulousness of someone arriving at a diagnosis they would have preferred not to have to make after much deliberation. And his fighting forces that are. She searched for the right word, found it, set it in place, intrinsically different from anything any of us understood, at least before this. She gestured toward the horizon of the interior space. The network Celthea had left behind when she dissolved hadn't fully disappeared. They extended toward the edges of the space like the outer structure of something enormous waiting just past the library's limits, branching threads of corrupted energy that seemed to reach endlessly into the dark beyond the walls, showing clearly how far the influence had spread before it was pushed back. The map of what really was the true body of the girl that had been here. It seems the corruption isn't only the strange beasts we see outside, Larissa continued. It's something deeper. Something that works affecting the mana of the world at a more fundamental level. A pause. And he was dealing with that from the inside, at the same time he was dealing with everything he could from the outside. Lyra was watching the networks with an expression that mixed the exhaustion from before with something closer to a new worry and active concern. Not the kind that needed to spiral into catastrophizing the quiet since she was indeed that tired, but the focused kind of worry that was already looking for where to apply itself. That's what made him vulnerable in the first place, she said. The load. Not the corruption strength alone. Her fingers tightened slightly around the muscles near Ren's shoulder. He was sleeping with the heaviness of someone who had fallen more than drifted, the dead weight of total collapse. We have to reduce it. That load. Or this is likely going to keep happening. Luna still had her head against his chest, her ear over the place where his heartbeat was easiest to find. Her eyes were open, fixed on nothing in particular, with the expression she got when she was thinking things she hadn't decided to say yet, the internal machinery still running, sorting and filtering and deciding what came out and what didn't. It's my fault, she finally said with a soft voice. The other two looked at her. I've put too much on him. A broken voice but with no drama in it. Just the unguarded quality Luna's voice had when she decided to be honest without armor. I've placed too much hope in him solving things that are mine without actually seeing what it cost him. Things about my family. Situations that? She exhaled slowly. I assumed someone like Ren could handle, because he was so assertive after the dance and always handled everything easily. Without making sure if he really could. Without offering him anything in return except more weight. Lyra leaned slightly toward her. Then tell us more. Not just the surface. Luna looked up. Everything you feel, Larissa specified. Whatever you've been carrying too. So we can distribute it. There's no point in either of you carrying things alone when we're here too. Luna looked at Lyra, who nodded without saying anything. Then she looked at Ren sleeping. And she spoke. Not with detours. Not with the usual filters she used to regulate how much of herself she showed at any given time. She talked about what her mother's crystal actually meant to her, the real weight of it, not the version she described when she needed to explain it but didn't have the heart to let go of her tears for the full truth. The full fearful mind of the girl that had been trapped inside that castle. The uncles who used the sad result of that day as leverage, who had been using it lately for long enough that the leverage had become the shape of every conversation she had with them. How long she had been the only stable point in a family that was coming apart from too many directions at once, and how she had stopped noticing the cost of being that point because you stop noticing what you always carry. She talked about her father. About the particular weight of an absence that had no explanation attached to it. He had simply stopped being there one day, and the not knowing had a mass to it that she had spent a long time pretending was something smaller than it was. She said all of it. Without measuring her sulk face or grimaces. She didn't notice, while she was talking, that Ren's hand, which had been completely still for several seconds, closed slightly. Not enough to look intentional. Just the involuntary movement of someone sleeping deeply who is still processing, somewhere in a lower layer, what reaches them from outside. Lyra noticed. She didn't say anything. Somewhere beneath the exhaustion that was pressing everything else flat, something tied itself into a knot. Not a thought with words attached to it yet. Just a certainty, quiet and solid, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself, that when his eyes were able to open again, there was going to be a list. Long and complicated. With parts that were going to require more than he currently had available. But available or not, they were going to get fixed. All of them. Chapter 965, Taming Public Image. The mutants started dying on their own. It wasn't a gradual process in the sense of something weakening over time. It was closer to a system losing its power supply, functioning, and then simply not. The ones ringing the artifact fell first, then the ones farther out along the perimeter, and finally the ones still moving toward the center, as though the ritual that had called them was still active, still pulling, even though the core sustaining it had already collapsed from the inside. Julius watched it from his position near the center of the arena and did not feel immediate relief. He felt the specific caution of someone who has seen enough situations improve in inexplicable ways to know that inexplicable improvements have causes, and that the cause matters as much as the result. Sometimes more. He looked at the girls. All three were still suspended in the air, eyes open, irises burning with an intensity that had nothing in common with unconsciousness. These weren't the eyes of someone absent, they were the eyes of someone completely present in a space that wasn't this one. Julius and Lynn watched them blink at irregular intervals and took that as confirmation of what they were both already assuming. Either they were conscious somewhere deeper in, or it was an illusion produced by the shifting energy flow and their own need to believe things were going to be fine. Neither of them said which interpretation they preferred, as it was obvious. The light around the three of them pulsed without uniformity, not a steady glow but the fluctuation of four distinct energy sources attempting to share the same channel without having been designed to do so for long. If Julius concentrated, he could separate them: Larissa's clean light, precise and direct; Luna's shadow with a density that existed on its own terms, not the absence of light but a presence in its own right; Lyra's fire, bright and purple, pushing at the edges of whatever contained it. And surrounding all three of them, connecting them, threading between them and outward, something else. Something Julius had no reference to classify, but that he recognized as the root network tying everything here to the center of whatever was still unresolved. The ethereal mana between the girls and the entity was barely visible with the naked eye. A near-translucent web, almost solidified where it was densest, reaching from the three of them outward to the structure of the 8 artifacts with a passive nature of something that was not attacking but communicating. They were speaking to it, or through it, in a language that didn't use words. Lynn tightened her grip on his arm. Julius looked at her. "There," she said, with the calm voice of someone who had seen things adjacent to this with Ren before, and who for that reason said it without unnecessary drama. The dark entity that had occupied the peak of the artifact was changing. Not fighting or resisting. Just changing, the way things change when they lose the purpose that was holding them together. The form that had been a hybrid of shadow and corrupted power expanded outward in every direction at once, losing itself in the process, becoming first a sphere with no defined edges and then something closer to a dissipating cloud than a presence. The density drained out of it gradually and then all at once. What had felt enormous and powerful a short while ago was becoming something the eye could hold. The energy that had composed it began flowing downward. The 8 artifacts received it. That was the moment Julius found hardest to process, not the entity dissolving, but what the artifacts did with the energy when it arrived. They didn't respond like structures absorbing power back into themselves. They responded like something that had completed a function and was returning to the state it had occupied before being activated. Then they began to sink. Slowly, methodically, with the same movement with which they had risen from the ground, but inverted, as though something down the earth was calling them back and they were simply answering. And as they descended, several of the artifacts' arms came together. They lowered Ren to the ground. Julius didn't have a precise word for what he was watching. Lowered was the closest available and still not quite accurate enough. There was something in the way the arms adjusted their angle and pressure as they brought him down, that small, continuous calibration that no structure without intention produces, that belonged to a category Julius associated with people rather than objects. Like someone handling something that matters to them with a care they can't help showing even when they're not trying to. The word that came to mind, unbidden, was tenderness. He set it aside because it didn't make sense in context and he didn't have time to make sense of it. Something the watching crowd could not know, but that anyone who had witnessed the interior situation with Celthea might have connected to the strange girl's parting declaration that she intended to keep Ren entirely for herself. Ren came to rest on the ground near the girls. Julius held that image for a moment. Then he looked at the point where the entity had been, which was now just empty space and fading light. The girl seemed connected to whatever was happening, Lynn murmured from where he was still holding her, more to herself than to him. Maybe they'll have an explanation. Julius didn't answer because he didn't have a certainty to offer. The three girls descended slowly and opened their eyes almost simultaneously, with that specific transition of people returning from a very long distance who need a moment to locate themselves before they can do anything else. All three of them looked at Ren on the ground before they looked at anything or anyone else. And all three moved toward him with the same urgency, without consulting each other. Julius walked toward them. "I can walk," said Lynn. "Yes," said Julius, without putting her down. "I said, I can walk on my own." "Sorry." He set her down quickly and kept moving, already looking past her toward the center of the arena. I was lost in thought. Chapter 966, Taming Public Image, 2. After Julius and Lynn, those who had been holding the inner arena reached Ren first. His parents, Taro and Liu, whose beasts had specific capabilities that had kept them functional through the sustained defense when others had been forced back, still relatively fresh despite the hours, still clear-eyed in the way that Tamers were when they had pushed hard but not past their limits. Other fighters who had held the inner perimeter and stayed when the outer lines gave ground made their way in from the edges. The dead mutants covered the ground in every direction. Moving toward the center required attention to where you placed each foot, which meant the walk itself became a kind of accounting, each body on the ground a reminder that what had happened here in the last several hours was too large to process in a single pass. The mind touched the edges of it and moved on to the next step, and the next, because that was what the situation required. At least the involuntary pause the mutants had created while converging on the artifact had given the healers a window to work without the pressure of active combat, and the condition of the wounded was considerably better than anyone would have estimated an hour ago. Injuries that should have required painful and dangerous days were closed. People who had been down were sitting up. It was a fortunate result that didn't square with the ominous reason it had been made possible, and Julius noted the dissonance without resolving it. He noticed it in the faces too, as they moved toward the circle the girls had formed around Ren. Not in the ones who arrived first. Not in the people who knew Ren closely, who had fought beside him, who had the context to read the scene without filling in the blanks with the first available negative interpretation. In those faces there was no ambiguity, only the focused concern of people who already understood the boy they were looking at well enough not to need a story around this hostage situation. But further back, in the Tamers who didn't share that history, the ones who had been on the outer perimeter and were now moving inward because the immediate danger had passed, he saw it clearly. The question that nobody was putting into words, because this wasn't the moment for that, but that was forming anyway the way things form before they become words. In that manner a crowd's posture changes before anyone in it decides to say anything. Why had the corruption embraced him? Why had it given him power, and then released him, and then lowered him to the ground with that careful, almost reverent quality that had nothing corrupted in it, nothing aggressive, nothing consuming, but something that looked uncomfortably close to devotion? The boy who had broken the two-beast standard. The boy who knew things no one his age should know, who had neutralized threats that Tamers with decades of experience over him hadn't been able to neutralize. And now this. The boy standing at the center of something that none of the outer witnesses had a complete picture of, surrounded by the aftermath of something they couldn't fully explain, set down gently by something that should not have been gentle. It was too easy to think about Yino. About how that had started, and what it had become, and how little anyone had understood it until it was already decided. The boy who broke the two-beast standard, just as Yino had done before, ending up crystallized as part of the evil crystal they didn't fully understand. Julius watched that question taking shape in the distant faces. His people and Ren's had formed a ring around the scene first. There were no hostile eyes close in, not yet. The inner circle held. But this was not going to stay contained inside the inner circle for long. The distance between what the people who knew Ren understood and what the people who didn't were currently constructing was already visible, and distances like that had a way of growing faster than anyone planned for. Julius filed it alongside everything else that was going to need handling. Reed reached the center first. He knelt beside Ren and the girls and put his hands on Ren's chest with the practice moves of a healer who starts assessing before the patient has confirmed anything, even before anyone around him had finished deciding what to feel about what they were looking at. His expression was focused and unreadable in the way healers went when they were working. Fern arrived one step behind him and made no effort to maintain a composure she didn't have available. She knelt on the other side and took her son's hand in both of hers without saying anything, which said everything. Julius watched the girls shift slightly apart from Ren to look around, taking in the arena, the mutant bodies covering the ground, the people converging from the edges. The transition back into the external world happening in real time in their faces. "The beam," Julius said, pulling his attention away from the surrounding crowd and back to them. "Are you all right?" The three of them had that particular look that fusion left on a body when it hadn't yet finished calculating the real cost. Present and functional, eyes clear, responses intact, but with the kind of exhaustion behind them that a short rest wasn't going to resolve. "The kind you carried for days." Larissa was the first to answer with something organized. She laid out the interior situation with the precision she used when she wanted information to arrive useful rather than merely complete. The entity girl with white hair, the nucleus, what they had been able to observe of the roots and the crack and the vortex before their three energies entered the cycle and the picture changed. No unnecessary detail, no gaps either. The version that gave the listener what they needed to work with. Lyra and Luna added the pieces that remained. Chapter 967, Taming Public Image, 3. Julius listened without interrupting, which was how he listened when information was new and required him to update several things at once. Lynn's expression, beside him, was the one she had when something confirmed a theory she had already been carrying but hadn't been able to verify. Her eyes moved between the girls and the point where the artifact had sunk back into the ground, connecting what she was hearing to what she had already seen. Reed listened while his hands continued their work. Fern listened with her eyes fixed on Ren's face. Taro heard and understood roughly half of it. His expression was honest about that. Liu stood with his arms crossed and his jaw set in the way of someone who doesn't like what he's hearing but knows he needs to hear it. "The original corruption hasn't disappeared," said Julius when the three of them finished. It wasn't a question, he was already certain of it. "It's dormant. Maybe waiting for different conditions, maybe working on something we can't see yet. But it hasn't gone anywhere." "No," Larissa confirmed. "Then we need to." The ground moved. Not the familiar tremor of Earth techniques, which everyone in this arena knew by texture and frequency at this point. This was something different, the vibration of something emerging from below, pushing upward from the same point where the artifact had just finished sinking back in. As though the retreat had been a pause and not an ending. As though whatever had been interrupted was simply resuming. Mutants again. The flow that came out of the gap was immediate and large. Not the initial trickle of a new incursion but the sustained pressure of something picking up exactly where it had stopped, with no reduction in scale, the full weight of it arriving all at once. Julius didn't spend time thinking on it. "Fall back." He said it to the girls, to Ren's parents, to the healers, and to the tamers who had been active long enough that keeping them in combat was going to cost more than it returned. "Anyone with decent reserves follows me." Lynn took Ren carefully by the shoulders to help move him. Julius was already moving forward. The Earth Tamers from his group who remained fell into formation with the automaticity of people who had run this kind of sequence enough times that the individual steps no longer required thought. The ground rose at Julius's direction, barriers closing angles, walls cutting the space between the emerging mutants and the people pulling back into something with good elevation and resistance. The Earth knew his mana well enough by now that the conversation between them was short. But the mutant flow was large. As large as it had been at the start of this, possibly larger because the emergence point was now more concentrated than the earlier dispersal had been, all of it pushing through one gap instead of spreading across a perimeter. Julius held the line. He was holding it and had already noted precisely where in his reserves he was sitting and how long he would resist when the shadows came from above. Zhao landed without announcement, with the accuracy of a raptor who had picked his point of impact from the air and committed to it cleanly. His blade feathers cut through the front of the first wave before it reached Julius's barrier, buying space with speed that Earth couldn't generate on its own. Behind him, the high-mobility group spread across the perimeter with the coordination of people who had been working together long enough that basic positioning decisions happened without anyone issuing them. And on Zhao's beast, Selphira. Victor, in another unconscious but present, held by one of the other tamers in the group, color in his face and breath in his lungs. Julius took that in during the 1 second he could afford to look away from the flow. Victor was alive. Something in his chest that had been pulled tight for several hours released just enough to give the rest of his thinking room to function. He turned back to the barrier and kept working. "Tell me everything," said Selphira as Zhao's beast set her down carefully on the ground. With the reinforcements, the defense had stabilized into something that held well. "I think the eastern mutant flow stopped because you intercepted the twins, and the southern flow stopped because Orion redirected pressure to push the southern Wall-S army out of the Goldcrest territory," said Selphira. Her mana reserves were low enough to be visible in the way she moved, but her mind was running at its usual speed. He would have used that window to regroup his army and even his brother's crystals before pushing everything back here. "We saw the artifact from before, but complete," said Julius, closing a gap in the barrier without looking at it directly. "And the mutants we had here didn't stop moving or change direction, they were likely doing some kind of ritual. But now that you mention it, maybe they stopped coming for some time and those were the ones already here based on the summary I got." He gave her some more of the outline of the local situation in a few sentences: the convergence, the entity, the transformation, the collapse. Selphira processed it. Her face had the expression of someone adding up numbers she doesn't like. "Orion doesn't have full control," she said, with the tone of someone who has arrived at a conclusion that irritates her in a specific way. "If he did, there would have been no reason to pause for whatever that artifact process was. He's directing this flow, yet parts of it respond to him, but other parts respond to something above him that he hasn't accounted for." A pause, brief and precise. "The idiot is working for the original corruption without knowing it. He thinks he's using it. He's not." "You're sure?" said Julius. "No." Selphira's answer was immediate. "But it makes more sense than the alternative. Orion running that artifact from a distance and trying to corrupt our promising young Tamer at the same time. That's too many moving pieces for one foolish person managing it consciously." Chapter 968, Taming Harassment. Arturo arrived from the south with the army that couldn't move at Zhao's pace, plus some reinforcements he had been gathering by messages since the situation started shifting. He came fast but without unnecessary urgency, at the methodical pace Julius associated with his middle brother when he had been managing something complicated for a long time and had been managing it well despite how it looked from the outside. Jaw set and eyes clear. The specific composure of an Arturo who had already spent everything that could be spent on emotion and was now operating purely on the remaining structure underneath it. He positioned himself beside Julius and read the flow in 2 seconds. "The southern wall army is compressing the defensive perimeter," he said. "Here? Here's where I need you." Nothing else passed between the two brothers, because nothing else was necessary for the immediate function. The words that weren't said were words both of them already knew. What followed was work. Not the kind with large moments or decisive exchanges that could be described in a sentence. But the kind made entirely of small correct decisions executed consistently, one after another, without interruption and without acknowledgement. Arturo and Julius coordinating the barrier, trading pressure back and forth as reserves demanded. Zhao and his group covering the flanks, keeping the edges from folding inward. Selphira directing from a position that acknowledged her current limits without pretending they didn't exist, placing herself where her experience and her read of the flow were the contribution, not her output. Healers rotating between the people who needed it most. The rotation held. Not perfectly. Functionally, which in this context was the only kind that mattered. Orion's dissenting army and the portion of the southern wall force that had joined them pushed north after being driven back by the mutants. A second large contingent of soldiers who had been holding the south abandoned their section of the wall entirely to establish a new line much further inside city territory. The defensive perimeter contracted, leaving the majority of the Goldcrest zone outside its coverage. It was territory that would need work afterward: reclamation, damage assessment, the slow process of taking back what had been ceded again, but it was territory without enough civilian presence now for the decision to carry a cost in lives that couldn't be afforded. The evacuation had been effective when it mattered. The new perimeter was a little over 2/3 of the original. 2/3 was sustainable with what they had. The original size hadn't been. Julius verified it, adjusted the weak points, and looked west. The real problem had arrived in the form of information, which was how the hardest problems always arrived, not as something you could hit, but as something you had to hold in your mind and keep turning over until the shape of it became clear enough to act on. Orion had been moving his pieces while they were moving theirs. 2 armies. One coming from the north, one from the south, both converging toward the western side of the city with the coordination of forces that had a meeting point already agreed upon and were approaching it on schedule. Not a reaction to what had happened with the artifact Orion didn't even know had moved. But still a plan that had been in motion even before the artifact situation was resolved, timed to arrive at exactly the moment when whatever the mutants' flow had cost them would be most visible. Orion hadn't waited to see how things turned out. Either he hadn't expected the crisis to resolve, or he had calculated exactly this, that the crisis would exhaust what it needed to exhaust, and that when the metal was hottest he would be the one to strike the hardest. He hadn't stopped pressing at any point. Julius looked at the mutant flow that still required active attention at the perimeter. Looked at Selphira, who was not in combat condition and was not going to admit that until she absolutely had to. Looked at Victor, unconscious, being assessed by the best medical staff available. At Arturo, who had arrived from his own front with what he had left just after hours of his own fight. He ran the inventory of what was available against the 2 now merged armies. The inventory was not satisfying. Arturo. His brother looked up. The 2 of us are the only ones who can stop this. Arturo looked at him with the expression he had when he wanted to argue and had already recognized that the argument was over before it started, the resignation of someone who does the math himself and arrives at the same answer and doesn't like it any better for having confirmed it independently. Understood, he said, and his jaw tightened a fraction more. Julius was already looking west, calculating how long they had before the convergence stopped being a projection and became a fact. It wasn't much. Orion's message arrived on paper. Not an accident. Julius knew that the moment he held it, because Orion was the kind of person who calibrated every detail of a presentation to communicate exactly what he wanted communicated before anyone had read a single word. The paper was high quality. The handwriting was clear and unhurried, the script of someone who had written it without time pressure. The seal was correct, the right impression, cleanly applied, really nothing rushed about it. Everything in it was designed to say, I have time, I have control, and this exchange is a formality between parties who have already reached their conclusions. Julius read it once. Then he read it again more slowly, because some things deserved the effort of verifying them. The demands were close to what Orion had laid out for Selphira on the way to taking her underground. Complete jurisdiction over Lunar Starweaver and the territories tied to her lineage. Rights over the 3rd gate beneath the castle and any installation that Starweaver genetics could activate. Unsupervised access to the resources of the secondary vault. And the clause Julius read 3 times because he needed those 3 readings to be sure he understood the full scope of it, independent management of the most important installations, with no accountability to any existing authority. Julius crumpled the paper. Chapter 969, Taming Harassment, 2. The damn paper. Arturo, who had read it over his shoulder, had his jaw in the position it went when he was containing what he actually thought because what he actually thought wasn't useful out loud at this particular moment. He wants to plunder the vault first, said Julius, keeping his voice low. The space they were in had enough people within range for volume to matter. We already knew that. But the installations? He paused, holding the full implication of it. If he gives the corruption access to those installations. I don't think he knows he's doing that for it, uttered Selphira from where she was sitting, her more crystallized arm resting immobile yet hindering communicated how bad her situation was. Sitting helped since the hugging posture compensates for what the sensation could no longer provide. He believes he has control of it. He believes the crystals are his and the corruption is a manageable tool he's been clever enough to harness. Which he doesn't, said Julius. Which he doesn't and. The ground shifted. Subtle, not the kind of vibration that meant a bigger flux of enemies, but the kind that meant something changing direction before the consequences became visible. The adjustment of a flow before that same flow declared itself. Julius looked toward the perimeter with the attention of someone who can feel the earth like his body and already knows what complex new logistical trouble they're about to face. The concentrated mutant torrent they had been containing at the perimeter split. Not in two, but into 5 separate streams that began moving toward different points across the city simultaneously, each one with the directness of something that had a premeditated destination rather than a broad or imprecise direction. Toward the densest residential areas to the east. Toward the main market to the south. Toward the secondary access points that defenders had left with minimal coverage because the bulk of the pressure had been elsewhere and the resources hadn't stretched that far. Julius ran the available numbers against the necessary numbers at the same time. They didn't balance. They could follow the flows and distribute their people to reduce civilian casualties. Or they could hold their concentration to meet the army approaching from the west. With what they had, there was no version where they did both. Orion knew that. He had calculated exactly how much pressure needed to be applied across exactly how many fronts to ensure that none of the available options were sufficient to make the only rational exit from the situation one that involved at least engaging with his demands, at least opening the conversation. It was the kind of trap that didn't require walls because the geometry of it made moving in any direction look worse than staying. Julius leaned on Arturo for the logistics and still sent the redistribution orders with a bad feeling of doing exactly what he was being made to do, with no better option visible in any direction. "We need time," said Selphira. "Yes. And we need Ren." Julius looked at her. She didn't say it as some wishful hope. She said it as the logical analysis of their only choice, with the meticulousness of someone who has reviewed the available resources and arrived at the conclusion that one specific variable is necessary for the equation to produce the only different result. And the tone of a person who would have preferred the math to work out some other way and still was reporting what the math had actually said. "If he wakes up and can help us with the crystallization even partially," she continued, "then Victor can fight, I can fight. With the 4 of us together, you, Arturo, Victor, and me, and whatever is left of the defense units, we might be able to press Orion hard enough to break through that barrier of light." A pause. "But we need the fusions. All for together. Without that we have no realistic way through the crystal barrier protecting him." "None." Julius didn't answer immediately, because there was no answer to give until he had evaluated the rest of it. "What is asking for regarding Luna?" he said then. The name changed the texture of the atmosphere, thickened it, and gave it an uncomfortable direction. "Larissa won't agree either," he added. "No," Selphira confirmed. "But we only need the girls to pretend to accept for a limited time." A pause that carried the weight of a decision already made. "Though we're not going to give them the choice to say no for now." The unpleasant decision landed with the full weight it carried. Julius let it land. "So we send the acceptance message," he said. "Not a question. You send the acceptance message." Selphira said it with the tone of someone who has reviewed every available option and arrived at the only one that leaves any room to maneuver afterward. "But with conditions of substance. Orion wants to make this official. He wants the ceremony because without it what he has is a coup, and with it he has a functioning government he can use when the crystal energy eventually runs out. And for the ceremony he needs to establish at least some arguable claim to the things he's demanding, since several of them are rewards tied to Luna and Ren specifically." Julius crossed his arms. "And Luna is going to accept this willingly? I don't think she even knows the crystal is being USD. Luna doesn't need to accept it willingly." Selphira raised a hand before he could continue. "Not in the way you're thinking. Also, if Orion wants to use the Starweaver genetic key for what he's planning, he needs her physical presence. That's the last piece of positioning we have right now." Her eyes moved toward the great hall of the castle, reading something in the space that the others in the room weren't looking at. "The New Year ceremony has a protocol that is very old and very respected. The hall is wide and it will give us the opportunity to look for vulnerabilities in the barrier up close. And if we use the time the negotiations and preparations require for someone to wake up and someone to recover enough to move. It's a risky gamble. Everything we have left is a gamble. Selphira said it without drama, the same way she would state that the sky was a particular color. The difference is that this is the last one we have and the one I understand well enough to bet on. Chapter 970, Taming Harassment, 3. Julius looked at Arturo. Arturo had the same expression as before, the one that meant he wanted to argue and had already recognized the argument was over. He nodded once. But we need to think about how to slow down the now smaller mutant flows enough that the city doesn't fall while we do this. Julius looked back at his brother. Hold the defense. I'm going to respond to Orion positively on his demands and buy us the time we need to prepare the ceremony. Give me an hour to come and help you later. An hour? Arturo repeated, with the tone of someone accepting a deadline that both of them knew could shift with circumstances, but that served as an anchor for the next sequence of decisions. Selphira got to her feet with the careful economy of someone who had calculated exactly how much effort each movement could cost and was not going to spend more than necessary on any of them. She gestured to one of the attendants to bring Victor along. He was still on a stretcher, still surrounded by medical staff, still unconscious, and started walking slowly toward the castle. Use that diplomatic talent you've been building your whole life to buy us the time we need, she said to Julius without turning around. I need to go speak with Luna. The room in the castle's recovery wing had the specific quiet of a space where someone nearby is sleeping deeply. Lyra's breathing was the steady rhythm of a person who had spent everything they had and whose body had taken over the situation without asking permission. Her face in sleep had the unguarded quality that young people's faces had when they were genuinely resting, free of the accumulated tension that builds through waking hours, the expressions that got constructed over a day's worth of decisions all temporarily gone. She would probably need a full day to surface. Maybe more. Ren was different. Luna had been watching him from the chair she had occupied for some time without moving, hands folded in her lap, eyes on his face with the focused attention of someone looking for something they aren't sure is there. His parents had gone to prepare food. His other friends were still supporting the defense. In theory there was nothing left to worry about, the breathing was steady, the color in his face was normal, the medical assessment had been clear. But something about the way he was sleeping didn't look like ordinary rest. It looked like the silence of a system that had redirected all available resources toward a repair or restructuring that couldn't happen any other way, the kind of deep internal work that required the outside to be completely quiet while it ran. Less like recovery and more like reconstruction. How long? That was the question Luna had been turning over since they brought him here, and it had no answer because no one in the castle had any reference for what had just happened inside that boy. Whether they needed him soon, in several ways, was obvious. When soon was going to be something nobody could tell her. Larissa was standing by the window. She had been looking out for a while, then at Ren, then out again, the pendulum movement of someone working through a thought that the visible surroundings weren't helping resolve. The room was comfortable enough and there was nothing useful to do in it, which was its own particular problem for someone who processed things better when there was something useful to do. After a few more minutes she made the decision she had been considering. I'm going to find water, she said. Luna nodded without speaking. It wasn't that they needed water especially. It was the kind of reason a person gives themselves when what they actually need is a hallway and 3 minutes of movement to let a thought find an order it can't find while sitting still in the same room. Larissa closed the door carefully behind her. The recovery wing corridor was long and relatively quiet. Her footsteps on the stone had that particular echo of castle architecture, the kind of construction that doesn't absorb sound but redistributes it with an uncomfortable honesty, so that every step announced itself twice. She walked without hurrying. She thought about Ren sleeping with that non-ordinary silence. About everything Luna had said in the interior space, with an openness Larissa hadn't seen from her in any conversation with others present, the kind of openness that didn't come from a decision but from circumstances making the filters temporarily gone, and about the feeling it had left her with, of carrying something that wasn't hers to hold alone but that had nowhere to be put yet. She thought about what they told Julius before they were brought back to the castle, described with just enough detail that the detail conspicuously missing was clearly the part that was going to matter most. She thought about Luna. She turned the corner toward the room where the water jugs were kept and found Selphira walking in the opposite direction. Both of them stopped. Larissa assessed what she saw in the time it took her to assess anything relevant. Selphira was standing with the posture of someone who refused to allow the body to show what the mana reported anyway, but the mana didn't lie to people with the sensitivity to read it, and Larissa had that sensitivity. The signature was real and present, responsive, but all of the basic structures. Its damage was different from any reading Larissa had taken of her before, in the limited exchanges they'd had at distance over the past few years. It was like reading an ocean and finding that the floor was much closer to the surface than it should have been. Everything above the waterline was working. What lay underneath was another matter entirely. The crystallization had not been cosmetic. Selphira looked back at her with the direct, unfiltered attention Larissa had learned to recognize in adults who didn't consider the age of the person in front of them a reason to reduce the quality of their focus. Chapter 971, Taming Harassment, 4. You were going to find some water, said Selphira. Not a question. Yes. And mostly to think as always. Also yes. Selphira considered that for a moment. Then she did something Larissa hadn't expected. Instead of continuing past her toward Ren's room, she stopped in the corridor with the posture of someone who had recalculated their destination and decided that here was sufficient. I was going to find Luna, she said. I need to speak with her about something that affects her directly and that she isn't going to want to hear. A pause. But you're here first. Larissa didn't respond immediately. This is not an accident, she said finally. The way you said that. No. Selphira didn't elaborate where elaboration wasn't needed. She was the kind of person who let silence do the work when silence was more efficient than words. Luna is going to need someone who she has opened up to before. Since you girls are lacking some important points, I'm almost certain the boy didn't divulge to you. So when I arrive and say what I have to say, someone who understands the full situation can share some acknowledgement with her. She found the right words with the cunning of someone who had the judgment to choose it. And help her process the part that isn't political before we have to talk about the part that is. Larissa looked down the empty corridor toward the room. Then she looked back at Selphira. How bad is that political part you have to tell her? Direct to the point. So Selphira answered also with the direct honesty that was probably the only thing Larissa would have accepted at this moment. Bad in the sense that there is no version of this situation she is going to like, and no version where she isn't at the center of something she didn't choose to be part of. A very brief pause. But not bad in the sense that there is no way out of it. Another pause, shorter. If we play it well. And if we don't play it well. Selphira didn't answer that directly. What she said was, that's why I need Luna to have someone with her when I arrive. Larissa looked at the woman in front of her. At the widespread crystallization damage, especially in her arm. At the posture compensating for what the body no longer did automatically. At the mana signature that was a very small fraction of what it should have been but was still holding itself organized and functional anyway, because several hundred years of practice produced that kind of control, the kind that ran on structure when the fuel was gone. Larissa stepped to the side to make room in the corridor. But tell me first, she said. Orion marched slowly. It wasn't some timing imprecision. It was the deliberate kind of slowness that communicated something, the pace of someone who knows the other side needs more time to prepare a coherent response, and who therefore has no reason to arrive before that need has been felt at its fullest. Every kilometer he took longer than necessary was a kilometer during which Arturo had to maintain the defense, had to keep splitting his forces, and the Tamers who had been active for too many consecutive hours had to stay active for one more. Pressure without the expense of direct combat was the particular advantage that the staggering volume of mutants beneath the ground gave him, and he was using it the way someone uses a hand they're confident in, without rushing, without showing the cards, letting the weight do the work. Julius recognized it from the first response message. The tone was that of someone for whom the urgency lived entirely on the other side of the exchange. What followed was a negotiation Julius would have found genuinely interesting under different circumstances. Orion bargained with the confidence of someone who believed his crystals resolved any tactical discrepancy that might arise, a confidence Julius understood perfectly, because in terms of raw power it was difficult to argue with. The barrier was real. The crystals storing extraordinary captured abilities were real. The unified army of opportunist factions now marching from the west, consolidated and complete, was real. But Orion had a need that Julius understood just as clearly. He needed this to be official. A coup without ceremony was a usurpation. A usurpation could be maintained by force for as long as the force held, but it demanded an indefinite expenditure of his crystal's energy to contain the resistance that would inevitably organize itself in the margins, the pockets of opposition that never fully dissolved, the figures who became focal points, the slow erosion of control that came from having to manage resentment rather than consent. It required years of the kind of work that left marks and enemies and no clean way to stop doing it. Orion clearly didn't want that when a cleaner alternative existed. The ceremony gave him legitimacy. Legitimacy reduced the long-term cost by an order of magnitude. Which meant Julius had something to offer even though the immediate balance of force, after the loss of his two most powerful assets, was not in his favor. He had the one thing Orion couldn't manufacture on his own, the credibility of the other side agreeing to the terms. He accepted moving the mutant flow to the empty Starweaver sector in the northeast, Julius told Arturo while dictating the next message. Further from the castle, from the residential areas, and from the supply storage. Arturo looked at him. That splits my formation from yours even further. At least distance-wise, the separate flows were a problem, but they were closer to. Yes, but this makes the flow more manageable overall and saves more civilian lives, because the northern sector has fewer critical access points. Julius sealed the message. Orion is going to accept because it serves him to have your side and mine further apart, and because in the general accounting he doesn't care where the mutants are being contained as long as they're keeping us weaker and more dispersed than him. He isn't using the flow to win. He's using it to maintain pressure, because if it actually overruns us it creates problems for him too in the end. Chapter 972, Taming Harassment, 5. They were still under the same rules. Arturo processed that. His jaw tightened another fraction. He didn't like it, but he understood it. Orion's response came back in under 10 minutes. He simply accepted. And he added, with the specific elegance of someone who wants their generosity on the record, that there were undoubtedly many honors to be distributed among many entities, large and small, and that nobility would not be noble if its rules were not applied with equal rigor to all. It was a way of saying that the ceremony was where he intended his new order to be made public, and that delaying it only accumulated losses that Julius could spare himself. Julius responded in the same register. He expressed appreciation for the consideration. He noted that precisely out of respect for that principle, the ceremony required preparations that honored tradition, and that tradition had its own protocol regarding attendance by lineage. One lineage, one limited delegation. Orion accepted that too, without negotiating. Julius read that acceptance more carefully than all the previous ones, because it was the one that mattered most for what he was building around it. The ceremony hall operated under a fixed attendance protocol, a small number of soldiers per family established by historical precedent that no faction could alter unilaterally without violating the same rules Orion was invoking to legitimize himself. Which meant that Orion's army, large as it was, would remain outside, separated from the hall by hundreds of substantial historical buildings that weren't easy to destroy or move through quickly. Inside, only his elite. Inside also, the elite who answered to Julius, whose numbers were still, despite everything, slightly greater than Orion's inner circle. It wasn't parity when the crystals were factored in. But it was considerably better than open ground against a full army when the defender was dispersed and exhausted. "You're giving him the ceremony he wants," said Arturo, who had been reading the exchange in silence. "I'm giving him the stage where he has the least advantage." Julius folded the final message before sealing it. If what he wants is to avoid spending his crystals on a prolonged war of attrition, then what he has to do is behave during the ceremony. And I want him to behave, because if he behaves that's when I can take enough from him that losing today isn't permanent. A pause. When I can secure a future for the kids. Arturo considered that. And if he cheats anyway, then the coup protocols activate. Julia said it with the calm of something already decided, requiring no further deliberation. Documents, seals, artifacts, old keys, everything Orion needs to run this castle and a functional government instead of a disorganized occupation. All of it disappears into a resistance network that creates problems for him for years. Decades even. A pause. Time during which other things can grow in places he isn't watching. Arturo was quiet for a moment. You already have that prepared, he said at last. I've been preparing for it since Orion started marching. Arturo made the sound he made when his jaw was tight and he was compressing approval into its smallest possible form. Not a compliment. Just the acknowledgement that the information was satisfactory. The corridor where Larissa listened to Selphira had no name on the castle maps, one of those functional passages that connected wings in ways the protocol had never needed to distinguish or label. But Larissa was going to remember it, because it was where several things became clear to her at once. Selphira didn't hide anything from her. She laid out Orion's situation, Luna's position, the full shape of what was being constructed and what it required. She included her unverified assumptions and identified them as such. She explained to her their reason why Luna would be moved toward action rather than paralysis or protection. As a bait. So as her close friend and family the reaction would be. But then Larissa said something unexpected. Tell her everything. Including about her aunt, about the real reason behind what happened to her mother and about her father's sacrifice and why he made it. A pause. Including the parts that will hurt her most. Wouldn't that break Luna entirely? To learn finally that everything she had suffered, the family she had wanted back, had been the direct result of the decisions and the absurd plan of someone as close as her father's own brother. Sirius told her that Luna had always believed that most of her misfortune had the quality of a natural disaster, bad luck, the kind she had made her peace with and learned to carry. Something that had happened to her family rather than something done to it. But now this. Yet Larissa's reasoning was simple and precise. Luna didn't freeze under intense pain, even if her exterior made it look that way. What she actually did, when something reached her at the level that mattered, was become aggressive in a particular and focused way. She would do almost anything to bring down someone who had betrayed her family far more deeply than she had ever known, from the inside, from the beginning. So real pain doesn't paralyze her, Selphira repeated slowly, as if placing the piece where it belonged. I'm glad I spoke with you first. She paused. I was operating under the wrong assumption, that she was like her father. But she's much more like her mother. It seems I never gave her something worth suffering over enough to see that. Larissa nodded. But what if her reaction is too immediate? Selphira asked. What if she acts before we have her position properly set? Isn't that exactly why you found my mana signature first? Larissa exhaled with a slight smile that had something mischievous in it. You don't need to maneuver me or guide me toward it. I understand why it's necessary. A beat of Silene. You can leave the second part to me. You caught me. Selphira looked at her with the directness of someone who has assessed their interlocutor and decided they can receive things straight. But I'm glad to see you haven't lost the touch. I hope you can keep tormenting Victor with that mind of yours when this is over. I knew you were the most suited for this part, that's why I told you first. Because you can hold her. You can make sure she hears the complete context before she reaches the conclusion. Another pause. Or takes action. Larissa thought about Luna sitting beside Ren's bed, with a stillness that wasn't peace but the surface of something that had been pushing upward for a long time without finding a way out. Tell me the rest, she said. The complete plan. Selphira did. Chapter 973, Taming the Ceremony. Luna listened to all of it. She didn't interrupt. Larissa knew her well enough to understand that Luna's silence during a difficult conversation wasn't passivity, it was active processing, the internal machinery running in parallel with the words arriving from outside, filing and cross-referencing and building toward something while the surface stayed still. Her father adjusting the truth of the crystal heart. her uncles being far more responsible for her misfortune than she had ever believed. What Orion had laid out as though Luna were a trophy with a genetic key rather than a person with her own capacity to decide anything. The part about Orion was where the texture of the silence changed. Luna didn't cry. Her eyes went still with that particular quality they had when something cold settled in behind them and took charge of the rest. Not shutting down, but reorganizing, the way a room looks different when someone has quietly decided what is going to happen next and has already started rearranging the furniture in their head. "When is the ceremony?" she asked. "This afternoon." "Julius couldn't delay them more than a day," said Larissa. Luna looked at Ren and Lyra, both still sleeping, for a moment. "They still haven't moved at all." "Not while you were sleeping." Another moment of silence. "Good." The word came out with a sharpness that had nothing resigned in it. It was the voice of someone who has made a decision and is already in the next part. "Then I'll have the freedom to be ugly and aggressive and act as horribly as I want without being seen by them for now." A very brief pause. "As those are monsters to deserve." Larissa opened her mouth. "I'm not going against the plan," Luna cut her off, with something that didn't quite reach a smile but occupied the same space. "I'm going to contribute to it." She stood up. "Which is different." Lyra woke 2 hours later looking like someone whose body had collected the full bill and who had slept exactly enough to be able to pay tomorrow's installment. Not recovered, but functional enough to move. She sat up, blinked, took in the room, the common unhurried inventory of someone orienting themselves after a sleep that went deeper than usual. Her eyes moved to Ren in the next bed, who was still carrying that non-ordinary quiet, and then to Larissa, sitting in the chair Luna had occupied before. "How long?" she asked. "Almost 30 hours. Lyra processed that. "And Ren has shown any signals of?" Larissa shook her head. "Nothing. Same as the first hour." "What did I miss then?" What followed was the organized version Larissa had prepared while waiting, because Larissa understood things and was capable of producing organized summaries of complex situations with the same easy instinct other people breathed with, not an effort, just a mode she operated in when it was needed. Selphira and Victor had been treated but the improvement had been minimal. Both were still out of combat, unfortunately. Julius had negotiated the ceremony. Orion was marching almost in front of the castle but slowly, still applying pressure without committing to a direct engagement. The defensive perimeter had contracted but was holding. Luna was going to the ceremony without Ren. Lyra listened to that point and her face made the transition Larissa had calculated it was going to make. "You left her go alone." The voice had that quality of urgency Lyra used when she was working not to raise it and the effort was visible. "Luna is going to a ceremony where her horrible uncle is trying to claim her as property, Ren is still sleeping, and she's going alone." "She's not going alone," said Larissa. "We're going too." "I was waiting for you." "The two of us?" "The three of us." Lyra looked at Ren. "Him like that?" Larissa didn't answer immediately, because the honest answer was complicated and complicated answers deserved the second it took to formulate them correctly. "Julius is stretching the preparations as far as they'll go," she said finally. "Every hour he can delay the start is another hour of hope for waking him up." She looked at Ren too, at the stillness that wasn't rest. "But the ceremony can't be postponed any further. It started being prepared 20 minutes ago. If Ren doesn't attend he loses his rewards under Orion's pressure." Lyra went quiet. Then she got up with the speed of someone to whom exhaustion had stopped being a relevant consideration. "I need clothes." "In the wardrobe." One instant jump later Lyra was at the wardrobe. She dressed with the concentration of someone who has somewhere to be and no time for anything except getting there. 3 movements for her hair, tied back without ceremony. She checked the mirror for exactly the time it took to confirm the result was functional and not a moment longer. Before fastening the last button, she stopped beside Ren's bed. She looked at him for a moment with an expression that had several layers to it, and Larissa didn't try to read all of them, since some things deserved the privacy of not being read. Lyra put a hand on Ren's shoulder, carefully. "I know you're tired," she said quietly. No drama. Just the direct, honest register she used for the things that actually mattered, the one without any performance in it. But we need you. A beat. You know how this works. You never missed the important moments. You always made it to the end of them somehow. She took her hand back. So it's fine if you sleep until the last possible second. Larissa summoned her lynx, and together they lifted Ren carefully onto the soft fur of its back, settling him so he wouldn't shift. They moved out into the corridor. The castle hallway had that late afternoon light coming in at an angle through the high windows, turning the floor into a map of long shadows that stretched and overlapped toward the far end. From somewhere not too distant came the sounds of ceremony preparations, organized voices, the footsteps of people who knew where they were going because the protocol had told them where to go. The ceremony had begun. And Ren was still sleeping. The Starweaver sector was the emptiest front, so the best one for dealing with the mutants, but still the most complicated assignment Zhao had been asked to run alone. Not because of the density of the flow, that was manageable with what Arturo had left him. It was complicated because saying that giving orders to an entire army was manageable with maximum effort was not the same as being manageable with margin, and Zhao had spent a small but enough window of time doing this to notice the difference in every decision. The gap between those two things was exactly the gap where mistakes happened, and he was aware of it without letting the awareness slow him down. But every wave they contained here was a wave Arturo didn't have to direct the main army to handle. And Arturo needed to be at the ceremony. The reinforced blade feathers, sharpened by the bond with his raptor, swept across the left flank before the next wave reached the Earth Tamers holding the center of the line. Clean cuts, precise angles, no feathers wasted on targets the ground formations could handle themselves. We hold here, he said to the nearest person with enough rank to relay it. Rotation every 20 minutes. Anyone who cycles out rests outside the perimeter and doesn't come back until called. He didn't wait for confirmation. Zhao rarely waited for confirmations when he could keep shooting, and the situation was clear enough that confirmations were a luxury of time that didn't exist. He'd compensate for whatever he lacked in Arturo's kind of leadership with offensive support and positioning, filling the gaps where they appeared rather than trying to manage everything from the center. Arturo had looked at him once before turning toward the castle. Don't move from here for at least 10 hours, he'd said. It was an unnecessary instruction. Zhao had enough judgment to know exactly that without being told. But it was the kind of thing that got said anyway, because saying it out loud made the instruction exist in the shared space between two people rather than only in one person's head. Arturo had turned, jaw still set at its permanent angle for this particular day, and left. Zhao returned his attention to the line. The largest ceremony hall near the castle of Yano had the kind of architecture that changed the way sound worked inside it. Old stone, the kind that had absorbed centuries of use and gave it back as a constant low resonance that had no equivalent in newer construction. The columns rose to a ceiling whose height Julius had once discussed in a conversation about acoustics that had seemed theoretical at the time and turned out now to be practically useful. It meant that conversations happening at the edges of the hall carried to the center with considerably more clarity than the people holding them expected. Sound didn't disappear in a room like this. It traveled, reflected, and arrived. Julius had chosen the positions with that in mind. Chapter 974, Taming the Ceremony, 2. Weirdly, Orion wasn't pushing many advantages that affected the legitimacy of the ceremony. The attendance protocol was being respected. Each family within its representation limits, each contingent placed in the sectors the rules established. From a purely formal perspective, it remained a ceremony conducted as it should be, the protocol intact, the forms observed, every visible requirement met. But from any other perspective, it was a balance of tensions wearing ceremony as decoration. Orion occupied the west side of the hall with his elite. A small number compared to the army he'd left outside, but not negligible in individual terms. Julius had assessed them at the entrance with the same attention he'd gave to any data that needed verification before being used. Gold rank across the majority. Nearly half of them carrying the signs of people who had been active in the last several days and were still fully functional despite it, which said something about the quality and loyalty of the resources Orion had invested in this particular contingent. The crystal barrier was also active. invisible to anyone without sufficient mana sensitivity to feel it, but present in the way the air in the west section of the hall had a different texture from the air in the rest of the room, slightly denser, slightly weird in the way of something that remained filtering what passed through it. Orion had been maintaining it for hours, well before the ceremony started. Julius had not observed a single moment in which it wasn't active, and he had been watching since before they walked in. On the opposite side, Luna stood with the posture of someone who had worn protocol clothing enough times that the body knew how to use it correctly without being told. Composed from the outside, giving nothing away, the surface doing exactly what those same protocols required it to do. Barely enough to keep her from crossing the hall and confronting her uncle directly over what he was doing with her mother's heart, wearing it so openly, spending it so shamelessly, right in front of her. He had crossed the line? To her left, Larissa. To her right, Lyra, who was the only one of the three who occasionally looked toward a point in the hall that had nothing of visible interest in it. A specific point that Julius understood perfectly, because he was watching the same one, just a bit more discreetly. The hidden contingent watching over Ren's sleeping body was positioned in the upper gallery, behind several artifacts, materials, and pelts that suppressed mana signatures. Selphira, Victor, Ren. Victor more recovered than before but still unconscious, propped against the wall. Selphira still waiting for a miracle, even if she couldn't move right now, Ren, still in the state he had occupied since the interior space returned him to his body, the quiet of something still completing a process that couldn't be hurried from outside, regardless of what was happening in the hall below. Julius knew it because Larissa had explained it for him before they entered. And he knew it because every time his eyes completed their habitual circuit of the hall and reached the gallery point, Lyra was looking there, still worried. Julius had added 3 time-consuming protocols to the opening of the ceremony. The first was procedural, the formal count of all families present with their verified representations, which was mandatory by rule but which was normally abbreviated by mutual courtesy because everyone in the room always already knew who was there. Julius did not abbreviate it at all. He ran it family by family, representative by representative, in the full form the regulation specified, with the unhurried pace of someone who considered the procedure worth doing correctly. The second was historical, a reading of the negative precedents relevant to the type of rights transfer Orion was preparing to request, a practice that existed in the legal record but that no one had executed in its complete form in several reigns, because it was long and dense and assumed everyone was aware of the cases already. Julius delivered it in its entirety, watching Orion's side of the room while the master of ceremonies read, noting who shifted and who didn't, watching for the reactions that protocol couldn't fully suppress in people who weren't expecting to sit through the whole thing. Orion's reaction, from the outside, was almost nothing. Julius noted that too. The third was ceremonial, an unusually thorough verification of the state of the ceremonial artifacts, each one requiring activation and confirmation by a Tamer of sufficient rank before the main session could begin. A legitimate requirement, applied with a thoroughness that was itself a message. Orion accepted all of it. Not with enthusiasm, but still with the patience of someone who can afford to wait since the time passing is time during which his position doesn't worsen. Julius watched it in how Orion responded to each extension of the protocol, a slight gesture of acknowledgement, no objection, no visible impatience. Even when the family count took several minutes per family that under normal circumstances would have taken seconds, Orion exhaled lightly and resettled into his position like a person who arrived to an appointment with time to spare and is mildly inconvenienced but in no danger. Julius filed that observation. The confidence of someone who doesn't need things to go quickly because the things that matter are already secured. He feels like the barrier solves everything, Arturo said in a voice low enough that it barely existed. It hasn't failed for a single moment since he arrived. Unfortunately, we don't have any reason to think it's going to fail now. Julius didn't answer out loud. He gave the small nod that meant received and moved on. Beside Luna, Larissa tilted her head toward her by 1 degree. The kind of movement that communicated something in the right context without looking like communication. Luna didn't respond visibly. But her eyes, which had been holding the forward-facing calm she had installed since leaving Ren's room, moved briefly toward Orion with an attention that had nothing ceremonial in it. A look she pulled back from as quickly as it had appeared. From the other side of Luna, Lyra's gaze drifted toward the gallery. She caught herself. Looked forward. Then looked toward the gallery again. Larissa placed a hand on her arm with the discretion of someone adjusting another person's posture, nothing more. "He's fine." "You're going to give away the position," she said, the words shaped more than spoken, barely enough breath behind them to carry the distance. Lyra looked forward. The main section of the ceremony began when Julius had exhausted every available procedure and nothing remained that could be extended without violating the same protocol he had been using as a tool. The line between using the rules and breaking them was a line he knew precisely where it was, and he had run the preparations right up to it without crossing it. The master of ceremonies, a man old enough to have conducted these sessions through enough different political climates that his face had developed a permanent quality of having seen worse, which on this particular occasion was doing only moderate work, took his position at the center of the hall. He had the expression of someone who would have preferred not to be here and had the professionalism to do the job well anyway. "The New Year session for the recognition of rights and transfer of ownership is now open," he announced, with the volume and diction the protocol required, the words placed with that very specific deliberateness of someone who understood very well that what he was saying was going into the official record and would stay there. In accordance with the norms established in the Code of Lineages and in the presence of sufficient representation from families with an active vote. Julius listened to the opening formula with the full attention reserved for words where meaning matters more than sound. Each line was a confirmation that the rules he had invoked to set this stage were still active. Each confirmation was another boundary on Orion's room to maneuver inside the hall. There were a lot, but many weren't very useful. Yet the ones that existed mattered and were real, and real was the only quality that mattered in a room like this one. Orion listened too. Arms slightly crossed, the posture of someone waiting for their turn in a process they already know the ending of. His elite arranged behind him, motionless. The barrier active, invisible for many and yet constant. The same texture in the air on the west side of the hall that had been there since they entered, that Julius had not seen lapse for a single moment. Julius glanced at the gallery once, with the casual angle of a man checking the room. The darkness behind the artifact showed nothing that shouldn't be there. But there was also no sign of the agreed signal. So Ren was still sleeping. The ceremony continued. Chapter 975, Taming the Ceremony, 3. The Master of Ceremonies had been conducting sessions of this nature for 50 years. He had seen negotiations where both sides wanted an agreement and only needed the format to reach it. He had seen sessions where one party arrived with the decision already made and the protocol was merely the mechanism for putting it on record. And he had seen, less often, but often enough to know the category when it appeared in front of him, sessions where the hall was a battlefield with chairs and courtesy forms instead of weapons. Where every procedural exchange carried weight that the words themselves didn't show, and where the people in the room were simultaneously conducting two separate conversations, only one of which was audible but much less important than the other. This was that third category. The fight of this one was about time. He had known it since Julius Dravenholm insisted on the full formal representation count, which was a procedure that existed in the rulebook and that no one had executed in its complete form for several decades because it served no practical purpose when nobody abused the rules it was designed to prevent abusing. They were losing, and the second part would be the important one. He had confirmed it when Orion Starweaver left his army outside but was in no rush. And he had no remaining doubt as he managed the transition from the defense merits phase to the ownership claims phase, the point where everything that had been developing just below the surface was going to start being said out loud. Defense contributions are hereby registered for previously minor classified participants for the crisis period against mutants of the period 2 years prior, he announced with the same monotone volume the protocol required and the perfect enunciation of someone who had long since stopped needing to think about it either. The Starweaver Day faction, represented by Miss Luna Starweaver, certifies active participation in the defense of the external defensive perimeter with a recorded count of eliminations and effective defense certified by the highest-ranking Tamers present. But also, the Starweaver Knight faction, represented by Lord Orion Starweaver, certifies contribution in the Yino sector during the containment period. He paused, as the record required before the relevant complication. Both reward sets dispute portions of the same territory and leadership of the same family. Several of Lord Orion's non-budgetary rewards were therefore deferred pending the majority of age of the young lady. Another pause. The session now proceeds to the evaluation of complementary academic merits in accordance with the fifth-year record. Orion's faction representative was a man with a broad, unreadable face who had learned to present Orion's faction arguments with enough fluency that they sounded like his own conclusions. The Master of Ceremonies had seen him operate in 2 previous sessions, both of which had produced outcomes that were convenient for the opportunistic faction in ways that, reviewed afterward, had a clear shape to them. The final classification of the 5th year cannot be certified, the representative said, with the calm of someone who has prepared the argument in advance and is now simply delivering it at the perfect moment. The final examination was interrupted without a determined result. Consequently, Miss Starweaver's position in the standings cannot be established with certainty. Julius responded before the Master of Ceremonies finished registering the objection. The final standings don't depend on a single examination, he said. The points accumulated across the first 4 confrontations place Miss Starweaver in second position independently of the result of the interrupted examination. If she won that last confrontation, she finished second. If she lost it, she also finished second. The margin over the third-place finisher is sufficient that the result of one examination cannot alter the accumulated standing. The battle had barely begun. The Academy records are available for verification, Julius added, without raising his voice. The representative produced a response that the Master of Ceremonies registered without giving it his full attention, because he already knew it wasn't going to change the result of the argument. Julius was correct on the numbers, and everyone in the hall with sufficient judgment to evaluate that knew it. Luna, from her position, didn't change her expression. The Master of Ceremonies had been observing her with discretion. He was someone who had spent years learning to read people in formal spaces, the skill developed not through study but through repetition, through the accumulated experience of watching people try to manage what their faces showed in rooms where showing it cost too much. Miss Starweaver was a young Tamer with the posture of someone who had indeed worn protocol clothing since before she had the judgment to choose it herself. No visible tension. But there was something in the stillness of her eyes when they moved toward the west side of the hall that was not neutrality. It was the exact opposite of neutrality, scarcely contained with considerable effort. To her left, Larissa Dravenholm. To her right, Lyra Ashenway, whose attention divided itself between the hall and somewhere else with a frequency slightly higher than decorum advised. Luna's global second-place standing of the year was registered with little to no problem. The ownership claims over Starweaver territory took 40 minutes to untangle and develop fully, approximately twice what the Master of Ceremonies would have estimated for a session of this type under normal circumstances. The complexity came from the family's own structure, which had been accumulating fault lines for years before anyone in this room had been asked to sort through them formally. The Day faction controlled the eastern territories associated with the Sirius branch, the zones of lower population density but with the primary access points to the old commercial routes. Land that had been almost emptying since the disaster of nearly a decade ago, when most of the people who had lived there moved as far from the rift as they could manage, taking their presence and most of their contributions with them. The Night faction controlled the western sectors, now of higher density, and the extraction zones, plus the majority of the military agreements that had been gradually pulling the family's armed strength into Orion's orbit since the disaster, and further consolidated during the last period of Sirius's absence. That absence was the thing everyone in the room knew was going to be mentioned.